Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The chain link fence had seen better decades. Rust flaked off in Riley Carter's hands as they cut through another link, the metal snips making soft clicking sounds in the humid August night. Sweat dripped down their back despite the cool breeze that swept across the abandoned NASA facility, carrying with it the scent of overgrown grass and decay. Riley paused, pushing wire-rimmed glasses up their nose and checking the time on their phone. 11:47 p.m. Perfect. The security patrol wouldn't make another round until 2 a.m, according to the patterns they'd observed over the past 3 weekends. Urban exploration required patience, planning, and a healthy disregard for no trespassing signs. The Manned Spacecraft Center training facility had been shuttered since the late 70s, left to rot when NASA consolidated operations elsewhere. What remained was a sprawling complex of concrete buildings, their windows dark and empty, like the hollow eye sockets of some massive skull. Riley had been fascinated by this place since discovering it on satellite imagery 6 months ago. Tonight, they were finally going inside. Squeezing through the gap in the fence, Riley shouldered their backpack and jogged toward the largest building. The structure loomed against the star-scattered sky, its brutalist architecture speaking of an era when space travel seemed both inevitable and impossibly distant. A faded sign near the entrance read Astronaut Training Complex B, authorized personnel only. Riley had done their research. This building once housed simulators for the Apollo program, where astronauts spent countless hours preparing for missions that would take them farther from home than any human had ever travelled. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here they were, breaking into a place designed to prepare people for the ultimate journey, all because they couldn't handle the much simpler journey of high school social dynamics. The service door Riley had scouted earlier was secured with a chain and padlock that looked impressive, but hadn't been properly maintained. A few minutes with bolt cutters, and the chain fell away with a satisfying clatter. Riley winced at the sound, glancing around before slipping inside. The beam from their flashlight carved through absolute darkness, revealing a corridor lined with peeling paint and water stains. The air tasted of mildew and old electronics, with an underlying chemical tang that made Riley's nose wrinkle. Their footsteps echoed despite their attempt at stealth, the sound seeming to stretch endlessly down the hallway. Room after room revealed the ghosts of abandoned technology. Control panels with banks of dark switches, their labels faded beyond recognition. Training modules that might once have simulated spacecraft systems, now reduced to empty shells filled with dust and mouse droppings. Riley photographed everything, adding to their growing collection of urban decay documentation. It was in the third wing that they found something different, a corridor that seemed newer, its walls still bearing traces of institutional beige paint. At the end stood a heavy door marked with radiation trefoil symbols and warnings in multiple languages. But what caught Riley's attention was the keycard reader beside it, dark but somehow less corroded than the others they'd seen. Riley approached the door and pushed. To their surprise, it swung open easily, revealing a descending staircase lit by emergency lighting that still functioned after all these years. The mystery deepened with each step downward. The stairs ended at another door, this one unsealed and slightly ajar. Beyond lay a circular chamber that made Riley's breath catch. The room was dominated by a single piece of equipment at its centre, what appeared to be a partial lunar module cockpit, complete with instrument panels and a pilot's couch. Around it, banks of monitors and control consoles created concentric circles, all dark but somehow expectant in the emergency lighting's red glow. Riley had seen pictures of Apollo simulators before, but this one was different. More complete somehow, as if it had been preserved rather than abandoned. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam as they approached the central console, reading labels that sent shivers down their spine. LM guidance, life support, communications. But it was the lever that really caught their attention. Unlike everything else in the room, it gleamed as if recently polished. The label beneath read, Manual Override Temporal Sync. Riley frowned. Temporal sync. That wasn't standard Apollo terminology. They circled the simulator, taking pictures and running their fingers along surfaces that should have been covered in decades of dust, but felt almost clean. The pilot's couch looked recently serviced, its restraints unbuckled and waiting. Against their better judgment, Riley found themselves drawn to sit in it. The couch was surprisingly comfortable, moulded to accommodate a spacesuit but perfectly sized for Riley's slight frame. They leaned back, looking up through what must have been a simulated viewport at a dark ceiling painted with stars. For a moment, they could almost imagine what it must have been like, strapped into a tin can hurtling through space, Earth shrinking behind them, the moon growing larger ahead. The manual override lever gleamed in their peripheral vision. Riley knew they should leave it alone. Every urban exploration rule they'd learned screamed against touching unknown mechanical devices in abandoned facilities. But something about the lever called to them, as if it wanted to be pulled. They reached out slowly, fingers wrapping around the polished metal handle. It was warm to the touch, impossibly warm in the cool underground chamber. Riley hesitated for one last moment, then pulled. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Lights blazed to life throughout the chamber. Not the harsh fluorescence they expected, but the warm glow of instrument panels and status displays. The couch suddenly came alive beneath them, restraints snapping closed with mechanical precision. Riley's heart hammered as they fought against the straps, but the systems ignored their struggles. A deep thrumming filled the air, growing louder and more complex by the second. The monitors around the room flickered to life, showing displays that looked almost like star fields, trajectory plots, system diagnostics and configurations Riley didn't recognize. The floor began to vibrate, then shake, then seemed to drop away entirely. Riley's vision blurred, the chamber walls seeming to stretch and distort like funhouse mirrors. The sound crescendoed to a roar that threatened to burst their eardrums, and then silence. Riley's eyes snapped open to find themselves staring at instrument panels that were definitely not the ones they'd seen moments before. These were older, their switches and dials arranged in the familiar configuration of Apollo-era spacecraft. But they were active, glowing with operational status lights and displaying readings that scrolled across small CRT screens. Systems tech. Report status on guidance computer. The voice came from their right, calm and professional, with a slight southern accent. Riley turned and nearly fainted. Buzz Aldrin sat in the right-hand seat, his face visible through the clear faceplate of his spacesuit helmet. He was younger than in the famous photos Riley had seen, his features sharp and focused as he monitored instrument readouts. To Riley's left, another suited figure worked controls with the methodical precision of someone who had performed these actions hundreds of times in training. "Armstrong," Riley whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Neil Armstrong glanced over, his expression businesslike behind the helmet visor. "Guidance computer status, please. We're at 2 minutes to powered descent." Riley's mind reeled. Through the small viewport above their head, Earth hung like a blue marble against the starfield, impossibly distant and beautiful. They were in space. Actually in space, aboard what could only be the Apollo 11 lunar module, minutes away from the most famous landing in human history. The guidance computer," Riley fumbled, looking at the panels before them. Their knowledge of Apollo systems came from documentaries and Wikipedia articles, hardly sufficient for operating actual spacecraft. But somehow the controls made a kind of intuitive sense. Green lights meant good, red meant problems, yellow meant caution. The basics of human-machine interface hadn't changed much in 50 years. All systems showing nominal, Riley managed, hoping they sounded more confident than they felt. "Guidance computer is tracking properly for landing site approach." "Roger," Armstrong replied, his attention already back on the approach trajectory. "Houston, this is Eagle, beginning powered descent sequence." The crackle of radio static filled the cabin as Mission Control acknowledged their transmission. Riley recognized the voice of Charlie Duke, the Capcom for this historic mission. They were really here, really part of this moment that had captivated them since childhood. But the initial wonder was quickly replaced by something approaching terror. Riley knew what happened next. They knew about the computer alarms, the low fuel situation, the last-second manual landing that brought Armstrong and Aldrin down with less than 20 seconds of fuel remaining. They knew because they'd studied this mission obsessively. watching every documentary and reading every account they could find. And that knowledge was now a crushing weight on their shoulders. What if they said the wrong thing? What if they caused some tiny deviation that cascaded into disaster? Apollo 11's success had been balanced on a knife's edge of engineering precision and human skill. One wrong word from Riley could turn humanity's greatest triumph into its most tragic failure. The lunar module shuddered as the descent engine fired, pressing Riley back into their couch. Through the viewport, the lunar surface began to resolve from a distant grey expanse into actual terrain. Craters, ridges, and plains that had never felt the touch of wind or weather. It was achingly beautiful and utterly alien at the same time. "Guidance computer is showing some instability," Aldrin reported, his voice carrying the first hint of concern. "Could be normal, but it's cycling between programs." Riley's blood went cold. The computer alarms, they were starting early. In the real Apollo 11 mission, the guidance computer had been overwhelmed by radar data, triggering a series of alarms that nearly caused mission control to abort the landing. But those alarms weren't supposed to start for another 30 seconds. They leaned forward, studying the readouts more carefully. The numbers were wrong. Fuel consumption was higher than it should be. Altitude readings didn't match what they knew from the historical record, and there were warning lights illuminated that should have stayed dark. "Houston, we're getting a program alarm." Armstrong's voice was steady, but Riley could hear the tension underneath. "It's a 1202. Riley's heart sank. The 1202 alarm indicated computer overload, the same alarm that had plagued the real landing. But it was happening too early, and the fuel gauge showed significantly less fuel than the historical accounts suggested they should have at this point. Something was wrong. Badly wrong. "Eagle, we're seeing the same thing down here," came Charlie Duke's voice from Mission Control. "We're looking at it. Stand by." But Riley couldn't stand by. Their knowledge of the mission told them that this alarm at this time, with these fuel readings, was not how things were supposed to go. They were living through some alternate version of Apollo 11, one where the mission parameters had been subtly but significantly altered. And if their knowledge of the real mission was any guide, those alterations might be enough to kill all three of them. "The alarm is indicating computer overload," Riley said quietly to Armstrong. "The guidance system is trying to process too much data, but it's still functioning. The computer is just working harder than designed." Armstrong nodded grimly. "Can we continue?" Riley closed their eyes, trying to remember every detail they'd ever read about the Apollo 11 landing. In the real mission, Mission Control had determined that the 1202 alarms were not critical, that the computer was still functioning despite being overloaded, but that decision had been made by teams of engineers with complete telemetry data. Here, Riley was the only one who understood what the alarm meant, and they had to make the call with limited information and the crushing knowledge that everyone's lives depended on being right. "Yes," Riley said finally. "The alarm is not critical. The guidance computer is still functional." "Eagle, Houston," Duke's voice crackled over the radio. "We've analysed the 1202 alarm. You're go to continue powered descent." Relief flooded through Riley, but it was short-lived. The fuel gauge continued to drop faster than it should, and through the viewport the lunar surface was approaching with alarming speed. They were coming in too fast, too steep, and with too little fuel. Even if the guidance computer held together, they were heading for disaster. "Jesus," Aldrin muttered, studying his instrument readings. "We're burning fuel like crazy. At this rate, we'll be running on fumes by the time we reach the surface." Armstrong's jaw was set in concentration as he studied the terrain ahead. "The computer is taking us into a boulder field. I'm going to have to take manual control and find a better spot." Riley knew this moment from the history books. Armstrong's manual takeover was one of the most famous moments of the mission, the point where human skill and judgment overcame the limitations of 1960s computer technology. But in the real mission, he'd had more fuel to work with. Here, they were cutting it even closer than before. "Neil," Riley said, surprising themselves by using Armstrong's first name. "There should be a relatively clear area about 200 metres to the west of where the computer is targeting. Smoother terrain, fewer boulders." Armstrong glanced at them sharply. "How do you know that?" Riley's mind raced for an explanation that wouldn't sound insane. Pre-mission analysis suggested that area as an alternate landing site, less optimal for geological sampling but safer for landing. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Riley was gambling on their knowledge of lunar topography gained from later missions and orbital photography. They had no way of knowing if the area they'd suggested was actually clear, but it was their best guess based on what they remembered of the Sea of Tranquility. Armstrong nodded and adjusted their trajectory, the lunar module banking slightly as he steered toward the area Riley had indicated. Through the viewport, the surface continued to rush toward them with terrifying speed. The fuel gauge now read critically low, its needle hovering in the red zone that indicated less than 20 seconds of burn time remaining. "Descent rate is increasing," Aldrin reported, his voice tight with controlled tension. "We're coming in too fast." Riley watched the instruments, their stomach churning with each passing second. The math was simple and terrifying. They needed to slow their descent rate while covering the remaining horizontal distance to the landing site, and they needed to do it with almost no fuel left. If Armstrong couldn't find a suitable spot in the next few seconds, they would have to abort, assuming they had enough fuel left to fire the ascent engine. But aborting now, Riley realised with growing horror, would be just as dangerous. The abort procedure required precise timing and sufficient fuel to reach a stable orbit where they could rendezvous with Michael Collins in the command module. With their current fuel situation, an abort might leave them stranded in an unstable orbit, unable to dock and doomed to crash back into the lunar surface within hours. "There," Armstrong said suddenly, pointing toward a relatively smooth patch of regolith. "That'll do?" The lunar module's engine continued to fire as Armstrong made final adjustments to their approach angle. Through the viewport, Riley could see individual rocks and small craters on the surface, growing larger by the second. The reality of what was happening struck them like a physical blow. They were actually landing on the moon, participating in one of humanity's greatest achievements. The fear and technical concerns faded for a moment, replaced by pure wonder. "Contact light," Aldrin announced as sensors indicated touchdown. "OK, engine stop." The sudden silence was deafening after the constant noise of the descent engine. Riley felt their weight settle fully into the couch as lunar gravity, 1/6 of Earth normal, took hold. They had done it. Against all odds, with fuel readings that should have meant certain disaster, they had successfully landed on the moon. "Houston, Tranquility Base here," Armstrong's voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the tension they'd all felt during the final moments. "The Eagle has landed." The celebration from Mission Control was audible over the radio, a burst of cheers and applause that seemed to echo across the 240,000 miles between Earth and Moon. Riley felt tears in their eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just experienced. They had helped land Apollo 11, had been part of history rather than merely studying it. But even as the crew began their post-landing checklists, Riley noticed something that sent a chill down their spine. Outside the viewport, the lunar dust that had been kicked up by their engine was settling in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Swirls and eddies that seemed to glow with a faint golden light, visible even against the harsh contrast of lunar day and shadow. "Are you seeing this?" Riley asked quietly, pointing toward the viewport. Armstrong and Aldrin looked where they indicated, but their expressions suggested they saw only normal dust settlement. "Seeing what?" Aldrin asked. Riley stared at the glowing patterns in the dust, their mind racing. The phenomenon was invisible to the astronauts, which meant it was either a hallucination brought on by stress and oxygen deprivation, or something that only they could see. Given that they had somehow travelled 56 years into the past and were now sitting in a spacecraft that should have been in a museum, hallucination seemed like the less likely option. The golden glow in the dust was growing stronger, forming what looked almost like a pathway leading away from the lunar module. Riley remembered the strange lever in the simulator room, the one labelled temporal sync, and the warm feeling of the metal under their fingers. Whatever had brought them here was still active, and the glowing dust might be their only way back to their own time. "We need to go through the surface operations checklist," Armstrong was saying, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "Buzz, start working through the camera setup. We'll want to document everything once we get outside." Riley tried to focus on the technical procedures, but their attention kept drifting to the glowing patterns outside. Time was running short. They knew from the historical record that the surface EVA would last only a few hours before Armstrong and Aldrin would need to return to the lunar module and prepare for ascent. If the glowing dust was indeed their path home, they would need to reach it during the surface operations. But that presented a problem Riley hadn't anticipated. They weren't scheduled to leave the lunar module. Their role, whatever it was supposed to be, involved monitoring systems from inside while Armstrong and Aldrin conducted their historic moonwalk. Getting outside would require convincing two highly trained astronauts to deviate from mission procedures, something that went against every instinct of their professional training. "Neil," Riley said carefully, "I'm showing some anomalous readings on the environmental systems. External sensors are detecting unusual electromagnetic activity." It was another lie, but one that might serve their purposes. Riley hoped that the mention of electromagnetic anomalies would be enough to justify sending someone outside to investigate. Armstrong frowned, studying his own instrument panel. "I'm not seeing anything on my displays. What kind of activity?" "Low level but persistent. It could be affecting our communications or life support systems. We should check it out during the surface EVA." "That's outside mission parameters," Aldrin said, looking up from his checklist. "Houston would need to approve any additional activities." Riley's heart sank. They'd forgotten about Mission Control's strict oversight of every aspect of the surface operations. Even something as simple as picking up an extra rock sample required approval from Houston. Investigating mysterious electromagnetic anomalies would definitely be outside the approved mission plan. But as they watched, the golden glow in the dust outside grew brighter, more insistent. Riley had the distinct impression that whatever was causing the phenomenon wouldn't wait indefinitely. Their window of opportunity was closing, and they needed to act soon or risk being trapped in 1969 permanently. "Actually," Armstrong said slowly, studying something on his control panel, "I am seeing some irregularities in the communication systems. Signal strength is fluctuating in a pattern I haven't seen before." Riley's pulse quickened. Armstrong was giving them an opening, whether intentionally or not. "That's consistent with the electromagnetic readings I'm detecting. We should definitely investigate during EVA." Armstrong nodded thoughtfully. "Houston, this is Tranquility Base. We're seeing some unusual readings on our environmental and communication systems. Request permission to conduct a brief investigation during surface operations." The response from Mission Control was delayed, presumably while flight controllers consulted with various specialists. Riley held their breath, knowing that their chance to return home might depend on Houston's decision. "Tranquility Base? Houston," Charlie Duke's voice finally crackled over the radio. "We're showing normal readings on all your systems from here. Can you describe the nature of these anomalies?" Armstrong looked at Riley, who scrambled to come up with a convincing technical description. "Intermittent electromagnetic pulses at irregular intervals, possibly originating from the surface near the landing site. Could be geological in nature, but we should verify that it's not affecting spacecraft systems. Copy that, Tranquility Base. You're approved for a brief investigation, but do not deviate significantly from the primary EVA timeline. Keep Houston informed of any findings." Relief flooded through Riley as Armstrong acknowledged Mission Control's approval. They now had official permission to investigate the glowing dust, even if the astronauts couldn't see what Riley was really looking at. The next several hours passed in a blur of checklists, systems checks, and preparation for humanity's first steps on another world. Riley tried to focus on their assigned tasks, but their attention kept drifting to the viewport and the golden patterns in the dust beyond. The glow seemed to pulse now, almost like a heartbeat, as if whatever force had brought them here was growing impatient. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Armstrong and Aldrin were ready to leave the lunar module. Riley watched through the viewport as the hatch opened, and Armstrong's white spacesuit emerged into the harsh lunar sunlight. The moment was exactly as they had seen it in countless documentaries and photographs, but experiencing it firsthand was something entirely different. "I'm going to step off the LM now," Armstrong's voice came clearly over the communication system. Riley held their breath as the commander's boot touched the lunar surface, and he spoke the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The golden glow in the dust seemed to pulse brighter at that moment, as if responding to Armstrong's historic words. Riley realized that they were witnessing the exact moment when humanity became a spacefaring species, when the boundary between Earth and the rest of the universe was crossed for the first time, and somehow, impossibly, they were part of it. "Buzz, are you ready to come out?" Armstrong's voice brought Riley back to the present situation. "I'm ready," Aldrin replied, moving carefully toward the hatch. "How's the footing out there?" "It's very fine powder. I can pick it up loosely with my toe, but it adheres in fine layers like charcoal powder to the sole and sides of my boots. Riley watched as Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface, the two astronauts beginning the careful, bouncing steps that would become iconic images of lunar exploration. But Riley's attention was focused on something else entirely. The way the golden glow in the dust seemed to be moving, flowing like a slow river toward a point roughly 50 meters from the lunar module. "Neil," Riley called over the comm system, "I'm reading stronger electromagnetic activity about 50 meters to your north-northwest. Can you investigate that area?" Through the viewport, Riley watched Armstrong look in the direction they'd indicated. His movements were careful, deliberate, each step planned to avoid losing balance in the low gravity. As he approached the area where the golden glow was strongest, Riley felt their heart hammering against their ribs. "I'm not seeing anything unusual out here," Armstrong reported. "The surface looks pretty uniform in this area." But Riley could see exactly what was happening. The golden glow was concentrating itself into a roughly circular area about 2 meters across, its light pulsing in rhythm with Riley's accelerated heartbeat. Whatever was causing the phenomenon was preparing for something, gathering energy for what Riley hoped would be their transport home. "There's definitely something affecting the instruments," Riley lied again, watching as the glow grew brighter. "I recommend taking a close look at that specific area." Armstrong approached the glowing circle, though from his perspective he was simply examining an unremarkable patch of lunar regolith. As he knelt down to collect samples, Riley made their decision. The glow was as bright as it was going to get, and they had no way of knowing how long it would remain active. This might be their only chance. "Neil, I need to come out there," Riley said, their voice steady despite the fear coursing through their system. "The electromagnetic readings are spiking, and I need to get some external measurements." "Negative," came the immediate response. "You're not equipped for EVA, and Houston hasn't approved additional personnel on the surface." Riley looked down at themselves and realized Armstrong was right. While the two astronauts were wearing full pressure suits, Riley was still in the clothes they'd worn for their urban exploration adventure. Stepping onto the lunar surface without a spacesuit would be instantly fatal. But as they watched the golden glow pulse brighter, Riley noticed something impossible. The circle of light seemed to be generating its own atmosphere, a faint shimmer that suggested the presence of breathable air. It was scientifically absurd, physically impossible, but then again, so was time travel. "The electromagnetic field is generating some kind of localized atmospheric effect," Riley said, the lie coming easier now. "I should be able to reach the source safely." "That's not possible," Aldrin's voice carried a note of alarm. "Don't even think about leaving the module without a pressure suit." But Riley was already moving toward the hatch, driven by an urgency they couldn't fully explain. The golden glow was beginning to fade around the edges, and they had the terrifying sense that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. In a few minutes the phenomenon might disappear entirely, leaving them stranded in 1969 with no way to return to their own time. "I'm sorry," Riley said, reaching for the hatch controls. "I have to do this." The hatch opened with a soft hiss, revealing the stark lunar landscape in all its alien beauty. The lack of atmosphere meant no sound except for what came through the radio, and the contrast between brilliant sunlight and absolute shadow was more extreme than any earthly environment. Riley hesitated for a moment, terrified by the prospect of stepping into vacuum without protection. But the golden glow was calling to them, and as they moved toward the hatch opening, they felt something impossible, the touch of breathable air on their face. Whatever was creating the phenomenon was indeed generating a localized atmosphere, a bubble of Earth-normal conditions in the vacuum of space. "What the hell are you doing?" Armstrong's voice was sharp with alarm as he saw Riley appear in the hatch without a pressure suit. Riley didn't answer. They couldn't explain what was happening without sounding completely insane, and they weren't sure they understood it themselves. Instead, they jumped down from the lunar module's ladder, their feet touching the powdery regolith for the first time. The sensation was indescribable. Each step sent them bouncing slightly in the low gravity, and the dust beneath their feet felt exactly as Armstrong had described, fine as talcum powder, but with a strange adhesive quality. And somehow, impossibly, they were breathing normally despite being on the surface of an airless world. "This is impossible," Aldrin was saying, his voice tight with shock. "You can't be alive out here without a suit." Riley looked back at the two astronauts, both of whom stood frozen in apparent disbelief at what they were witnessing. "I can't explain it either," Riley said honestly, "but I can breathe, and I think I know why." They pointed toward the circle of golden light, which was now clearly visible even to Armstrong and Aldrin. The phenomenon had grown brighter and more defined, creating what looked like a shimmering portal in the lunar dust. Around its perimeter, the air wavered like heat mirages, suggesting the presence of an atmospheric envelope. "What is that?" Armstrong asked, his scientific training overcoming his shock at Riley's impossible survival. "I think it's my way home," Riley said, walking slowly toward the glowing circle. Each step felt surreal, as if they were moving through a dream where the normal rules of physics didn't apply. The golden light seemed to welcome them, growing brighter and more defined as they approached. "Home?" Aldrin's voice was confused. "What do you mean?" "You're part of the mission crew." Riley stopped at the edge of the glowing circle and turned back to look at the two astronauts. They looked exactly as they did in the famous photographs. Armstrong with his characteristic calm demeanour, Aldrin with his more intense, focused expression. Both were legends, heroes who had risked everything to push the boundaries of human experience. And Riley was about to leave them, to return to a world where their achievements were historical fact rather than immediate reality. "I'm not who you think I am," Riley said, their voice carrying clearly in the artificial atmosphere surrounding the phenomenon. "I'm from your future, from 2025. Somehow I was pulled back in time to this moment, and I think this is how I get back." The two astronauts stared at them in silence. Riley could imagine what they were thinking, that the stress of the mission had caused some kind of psychotic break, that they were dealing with a crew member who had completely lost touch with reality. But before either could respond, Riley stepped into the circle of golden light. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The lunar landscape began to fade and blur, like a photograph dissolving in acid. The voices of Armstrong and Aldrin became distant and echoes, their words stretching and distorting until they were unintelligible. The golden light grew brighter, more intense, until it filled Riley's entire field of vision, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. Riley collapsed onto cold concrete, gasping for air that tasted of mildew and abandonment. They were back in the simulator room, sprawled on the floor beside the Apollo-era couch. The emergency lighting cast everything in the same red glow they remembered from what now seemed like hours ago, though their phone showed that only minutes had passed since they'd pulled the manual override lever. Shakily, Riley got to their feet and looked around the chamber. Everything appeared exactly as it had before. The banks of dark monitors, the dust-covered consoles, the simulator couch with its restraints now hanging loose. But the manual override lever had returned to its original position, and it no longer gleamed with that impossible warmth. Riley's legs felt unsteady as they made their way back to the surface, climbing the stairs that led from the hidden chamber to the abandoned training facility above. Their mind was reeling from what they'd experienced, trying to process the impossible fact that they had actually travelled back in time and participated in the Apollo 11 landing. Once outside, Riley pulled out their phone and immediately began searching for information about the mission. What they found made their blood run cold. The details were mostly the same as they remembered. Armstrong and Aldrin had successfully landed on July 20th, 1969, and returned safely to Earth. But there were differences, subtle changes that only someone with Riley's obsessive knowledge of the mission would notice. The landing site coordinates were different, matching the location Riley had suggested to Armstrong during the final approach. More disturbing was a photograph from the mission that Riley had never seen before. A grainy black and white image showing the lunar module with one of its landing struts visibly bent, exactly as it had been in the timeline Riley had experienced. But the most unsettling difference was in the transcript of the mission communications. According to the official record, there had been a brief period during the surface EVA when communications with Earth had been interrupted by what NASA described as localized electromagnetic interference. During that period, Armstrong had reported seeing unusual atmospheric effects near the landing site, but the phenomenon had disappeared before it could be properly investigated. Riley stared at the phone screen, their hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. They hadn't just observed history, they had changed it. The timeline they returned to was subtly but measurably different from the one they'd left, altered by their presence during humanity's first steps on another world. The walk back to their car felt like a dream. Riley moved through the abandoned facility and across the overgrown grounds in a daze, their minds still processing what they'd experienced. By the time they reached their beat-up Honda Civic, dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, painting the NASA facility in shades of pink and gold that reminded them uncomfortably of the temporal phenomenon on the moon. As Riley drove home through the empty streets, they found themselves thinking about Armstrong and Aldrin, wondering what they had made of their companions' impossible survival on the lunar surface and equally impossible disappearance. The official record suggested that NASA had classified the entire incident, dismissing it as equipment malfunction or stress-induced hallucination. But Riley knew the truth. They had been there, had breathed lunar dust and felt the weak pull of alien gravity beneath their feet. Over the following weeks, Riley found themselves obsessively researching every aspect of the Apollo 11 mission, comparing the historical record to their memories of what they had experienced. The differences were always subtle. A photograph they didn't remember, a technical detail that had been changed, a piece of equipment that had performed differently than documented. But they were consistent, creating a picture of a timeline that had been altered in small but measurable ways. The most significant change was in Riley themselves. The experience of participating in history's most famous space mission had given them a confidence they'd never possessed before. They found it easier to talk to classmates, to participate in group projects, to engage with the world around them. The knowledge that they had helped land Apollo 11 was a secret they could never share, but it gave them a sense of purpose and belonging they'd never known. And sometimes, late at night when they couldn't sleep, Riley would return to the abandoned NASA facility. They never went back inside. The memory of the temporal phenomenon was too intense, too overwhelming to risk experiencing again. But they would sit in their car outside the chain-link fence and stare at the dark buildings, remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than themselves. The manual override lever was still there, Riley knew, still waiting in its hidden chamber beneath the training facility, still warm to the touch and ready to transport another curious explorer back to humanity's finest hour. But Riley also knew they would never pull it again. Once was enough, more than enough, to last a lifetime. Because they had learned something important during those terrifying hours aboard Apollo 11, that history was not just a collection of facts and dates, but a living thing shaped by the actions and decisions of ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. They had been part of that history, had helped write it with their own hands and choices. And that knowledge, that secret connection to humanity's greatest adventure, was something that would stay with them forever. The dust of the moon still clung to their memory, golden and impossible and real. Jason Ward had always been the kind of kid who lingered too long at museum displays, reading every placard twice while his classmates shuffled impatiently toward the gift shop. At 16, he'd learned to embrace his reputation as the history nerd, even if it meant eating lunch alone most days at Lincoln High. His notebooks were filled with sketches of ancient weapons and detailed timelines of forgotten civilizations, much to the amusement of his peers who called him Professor Ward when they bothered to acknowledge him at all. Today's field trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art should have been paradise for him, but instead he found himself trailing behind his group, listening to Brad Morrison complain loudly about how dead people's junk was boring. The irony wasn't lost on Jason. Here he was, surrounded by artifacts that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, yet forced to endure the company of classmates who thought history began with their smartphones. The ancient civilization's wing stretched before them like a temple of glass and marble, filled with fragments of worlds that had crumbled to dust millennia ago. While Miss Henderson herded the other sophomores toward the Egyptian sarcophagi, Jason found himself drawn to a smaller alcove dedicated to Trojan artifacts. The display was modest compared to the golden treasures of the pharaohs, but something about it called to him with an almost magnetic pull. At the centre of the case sat a golden ceremonial cup, its surface etched with scenes of warriors and horses. The placard read, "Ritual Vessel, possibly used during the final feast before Troy's fall, circa 1200 BCE, discovered among palace ruins. Its original purpose remains debated among scholars." Jason pressed closer to the glass, studying the intricate engravings with the intensity of an archaeologist examining a fresh discovery. He could make out tiny figures of soldiers, their spears raised in eternal battle, and in one corner, what looked like a massive wooden structure. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail carved with precision that spoke of master artisans working at the height of their civilization. Something about the cup drew him in deeper than mere academic interest. The gold seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and the carved scenes appeared almost to move in his peripheral vision. Jason had always felt connected to history, but this was different, more intimate, more urgent, as if the artifact was trying to communicate something vital across the millennia. "Ward, keep up," Ms. Henderson's voice echoed from across the hall, but Jason barely heard her. The cup seemed to shimmer in the museum's carefully controlled lighting, and for a moment he could swear he smelled something that had no place in the sterile gallery. Wood smoke and roasted meat, salt air and wine. "Dude, you're such a freak," Brad's voice cut through his reverie. Jason turned just as his classmate shoved past him, apparently trying to impress Jessica Chen, who was examining a nearby statue. The push sent Jason stumbling forward, his palms slapping against the display case for balance. The moment his skin made contact with the glass, the world exploded into gold. Light poured through him, warm and liquid and impossibly bright. The museum dissolved around him like watercolours in rain, and he felt himself falling, not down, but through, as if the floor had become an ocean of molten honey. His ears filled with a sound like rushing wind and distant voices, speaking words in a language that felt familiar even though he'd never heard it before. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, moments becoming hours, becoming heartbeats in an endless spiral of sensation. The last thing he remembered was the cup's golden surface rushing toward him, growing larger until it filled his entire field of vision, its carved warriors seeming to step free from the metal and reach out with bronze hands to pull him into their ancient world. Then everything went black. Jason awoke to the smell of roasted lamb and burning incense, mingled with the salt tang of sea air and something else, something that spoke of celebration and impending doom in equal measure. His head throbbed with a pain that seemed to echo from both inside and outside his skull, and when he tried to sit up, rough stone scraped against his palms like sandpaper against skin. Gone were the polished marble floors of the Met, replaced by weathered limestone steps that led up to what could only be described as a palace courtyard. The transition was so complete, so jarring, that for several long moments Jason could only stare in stunned disbelief. This wasn't possible. People didn't just fall through museum displays into ancient civilizations. Yet the evidence of his senses was overwhelming. The heat of torchlight on his face, the distant sound of lyres and flutes, the very real weight of his own body sitting on very real stone steps. Massive columns rose around him, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories of gods and heroes, monsters and mortals locked in eternal struggle. Torches flickered in bronze sconces, casting dancing shadows across walls, painted with scenes of sea battles and divine interventions. The frescoes were magnificent, far more vibrant and detailed than any reproduction Jason had ever seen in textbooks. Here, Poseidon's horses reared from foam-capped waves with such lifelike intensity that he could almost hear their neighing, while Zeus hurled thunderbolts that seemed to crackle with actual electricity. The air was thick with smoke and the sounds of celebration, laughter that rang from stone to stone, music that wove through the courtyard like golden thread, the clink of cups being raised in toasts that echoed the rhythms of an ancient language Jason somehow understood. The feast was in full swing, and the sheer scale of it took his breath away. This wasn't some small gathering. Hundreds of people filled the space, from nobles in silk-trimmed chitons to servants hurrying between tables with platters of food that made his mouth water despite his confusion. "You! Boy!" A sharp voice made him flinch. A woman in a simple brown tunic stood over him, her greying hair pulled back severely and her weathered hands planted firmly on her hips. Everything about her spoke of authority earned through years of managing chaos, the kind of person who could organise a feast for hundreds while keeping track of every cup and spoon. "What are you doing lying about like a lazy dog? The feast has begun, and there are nobles to serve." Jason scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling. The woman's accent was strange but understandable, as if his brain was automatically translating her words. She thrust a tray of wine cups into his arms, real bronze vessels heavy and warm to the touch, filled with wine that smelled of honey and herbs. "You're the boy from the village, yes? Sent to work the kitchen tonight?" She didn't wait for an answer, her eyes already scanning the courtyard for other servants who might need direction. Well, don't just stand there gaping like a fish. Serve the wine to the high table and mind you don't spill a drop. This is the greatest feast Troy has seen in 10 years. Troy. The word hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his vision swim. Jason's gaze swept the courtyard again, taking in details he'd missed in his confusion. The guests weren't wearing costumes or reenactment garb. Their linen chitons and golden ornaments had the worn, lived-in quality of everyday clothes, showing the small repairs and careful maintenance that spoke of real life rather than theatrical display. The bronze weapons at the warriors' sides were notched and battle-scarred, their leather grips darkened by sweat and years of use. The very air seemed to hum with the weight of history, of a civilization at its peak yet balanced on the edge of destruction. And there, just visible through the main gates of the courtyard, loomed a structure that made his blood turn to ice. A massive wooden horse stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, easily 3 stories tall and broad enough to house a small army. Even from a distance, Jason could see the care that had gone into its construction. The smooth, sanded planks, the intricate carving of its mane and eyes, the way it had been built to look like an offering worthy of the gods themselves. To the Trojans, it must have seemed like proof of their victory, a magnificent tribute from their defeated enemies. But Jason knew better. He knew what crouched in the hollow belly of that beautiful death trap. "Move, boy!" The woman gave him another shove. Prince Paris himself sits at the high table tonight, and King Priam has called for the finest wine in celebration of our victory. Victory. Jason almost laughed at the bitter irony as he made his way through the crowd of feasters, the wine cups clinking softly on his tray with each step. These people thought they'd won. After 10 long years of siege, of watching their young men die on the plains before their walls, of rationing food and living in constant fear, the Greeks had finally sailed away. They had left behind only their magnificent gift, and Troy had dragged the horse through their gates in triumph, celebrating the end of the longest war in their history. The feast was a spectacle of wealth and joy. If Jason hadn't known what was coming, he might have been swept up in the infectious celebration. These people had endured a decade of suffering, and now they believed their nightmare was over. They deserved this moment of happiness, this night of wine and laughter and hope for the future. In a few hours, when the wine had done its work and the guards had fallen asleep at their posts, the hidden soldiers would emerge from their wooden prison and open the city gates to Agamemnon's army. By dawn, most of these laughing, celebrating people would be dead or enslaved, and their magnificent city would be nothing but ash and rubble. Jason wove between low tables where nobles reclined on couches upholstered in rich purple fabric, picking at platters of food that would have fed his family for a week. The abundance was staggering. Honey cakes dripping with sweetness, roasted fowl stuffed with nuts and herbs, wheels of cheese aged to perfection, and exotic fruits from distant lands that most people in his time had never even heard of. Gold vessels caught the torchlight and threw it back in warm dancing patterns, while servants in clean white tunics moved like ghosts between the tables, anticipating every need before it was spoken. Troy's wealth was on full display tonight, one last grand gesture before it all burned to ash. Jason tried not to think about what would happen to these treasures in a few hours, melted down for their gold, smashed for spite, or carried off as trophies by Greek warriors who had spent 10 years dreaming of this moment. The very cups he carried would likely end up in some Mycenaean palace, divorced from their history and meaning, reduced to mere objects of value rather than symbols of a civilization's pride. At the high table, he found himself face to face with figures he'd only read about in history books, people who had become legends and myths over the millennia. Prince Paris lounged on a golden couch, his famous good looks somewhat diminished by the wine flush on his cheeks, but still possessing the kind of charisma that could indeed launch 1,000 ships. His movements had the lazy confidence of a man who had never doubted his own charm, even after bringing disaster to his city through his choices. Beside him sat a woman of extraordinary beauty, her dark hair crowned with a diadem of pearls that caught the light like captured stars. Helen, whose face had launched those 1,000 ships and brought this war to Troy's gates, was even more stunning than the poets had claimed. But Jason could see something haunted in her eyes, a weight of guilt and responsibility that no amount of beauty could mask. But it was the elderly man at the centre of the table who commanded Jason's attention and respect. King Priam sat straight-backed despite his age, his white beard carefully braided with gold thread, and his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had kept Troy intact through a decade of war. This was the ruler who had held his people together through siege and starvation, who had ransomed his son Hector's body from Achilles with nothing but his dignity and a father's love. Lines of grief were etched deep around his eyes, the cost of burying too many sons, of making impossible decisions in impossible times. "Wine, your majesty," Jason managed, surprised that his voice came out steady. Priam nodded graciously as Jason filled his cup, then gestured for him to serve the others. As he moved around the table, Jason caught fragments of conversation that chilled him. The nobles spoke of plans for rebuilding, of trade routes that could now reopen, of marriages that would cement alliances with former enemies. They had no idea that in a few hours most of them would be dead. "The gods have smiled upon us at last," Paris was saying, raising his cup in a toast. "The Greeks have finally accepted that Troy cannot be conquered by force of arms." 10 years of war," added another nobleman, "and in the end they leave us with a gift of peace. Perhaps Athena has finally forgiven our slight to her vanity." Jason's hand tightened on the wine jug. He wanted to scream at them, to tell them what was coming, but who would believe a serving boy claiming knowledge of the future? Besides, even if they listened, what could be done? The horse was already inside the walls, and Jason had read enough accounts of Troy's fall to know that this night was inevitable. A hand touched his elbow, making him jump. A girl about his own age stood beside him, wearing the simple tunic of a kitchen servant. Her dark eyes studied his face with curiosity. "You're not from the village," she said quietly. "I know all the boys there, and I've never seen you before." Jason's mouth went dry. Yes, I am, from the outer farms." She shook her head. "Your accent is wrong, and your hands." She glanced down at his palms. "Those aren't the hands of a farm boy. Too soft, too clean." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Who are you really?" Before Jason could answer, shouts erupted from near the gates. Several guards were arguing with a group of drunken warriors who wanted to examine the wooden horse more closely. The distraction gave Jason a chance to pull the girl aside behind one of the massive columns. "My name is Jason," he said, deciding that some version of the truth might be his best option. "And you're right. I'm not from the village. I'm from very far away." "How far?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He studied her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes. "What's your name?" "Callista. I work in the kitchens." She crossed her arms. "And I'm still waiting for you to tell me how you got here, and why you look like you've seen a ghost every time someone mentions the horse." Jason glanced toward the wooden structure looming beyond the gates. Even from here he could see guards patrolling around it, though not nearly enough to matter when the time came. "Callista, how much do you know about that horse?" "It's a gift from the Greeks, an offering to Athena to ensure safe passage home." She followed his gaze. "Why?" "What if I told you it wasn't a gift at all? What if it was a trap?" Her laugh was sharp and disbelieving. "A trap? It's made of wood. What could it possibly—" She stopped, studying his expression. "You're serious." Deadly serious. Jason grabbed her arm. "How well do you know this palace? The city? I've lived here all my life. My father was a palace guard before he died in the fighting. Why? Because if I'm right, and I pray to all the gods I'm wrong, this city is going to be under attack before dawn, and we need to be far away from here when that happens." Callista stared at him for a long moment. "You're mad." "Maybe, but will you help me anyway?" The feast continued around them, growing louder and more raucous as the wine flowed. Jason watched the nobles and warriors celebrate their supposed victory, his heart aching for what was to come. These weren't just names in a history book anymore. They were real people with families and dreams, and in a few hours they would be running through burning streets screaming for their children. "There's an old drainage tunnel," Callista said finally. "From the palace kitchens it runs under the city walls to the fields beyond. My father showed it to me once, said it was an emergency escape route from the old times." "Can you find it in the dark?" "I think so. But Jason, if you're wrong about this, then you'll have wasted one night hiding in a tunnel, and tomorrow we'll laugh about your mad foreign friend." He met her eyes. "But if I'm right, that tunnel might be the only thing standing between us and death." The moon had reached its zenith when Jason decided they had to move. The feast was reaching its peak of debauchery, with half the nobles passed out in their couches and the other half too drunk to notice a couple of servants slipping away. As they made their way toward the kitchens, Jason caught sight of movement near the wooden horse. At first he thought it was just more guards, but something about the way these figures moved was different. They stayed in the shadows, communicating with hand signals rather than speech. As Jason watched, one of them approached a building near the gates and made a small mark on the door with what looked like charcoal. "Greek spies," he whispered to Callista. "They're marking targets for when the attack begins." She followed his gaze and went pale. "By all the gods, you were right." They moved faster now, fear lending urgency to their steps. The palace kitchens were nearly deserted, with only a few scullery maids cleaning the last of the feast dishes. Callista led him through a maze of storage rooms and pantries to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. "The tunnel entrance is at the bottom," she whispered. "It comes out in a grove of olive trees about a mile from the walls." The stairs were treacherous in the darkness, worn smooth by centuries of use. Jason felt his way down carefully, one hand on the wall and the other gripping Callista's shoulder. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying the scent of earth and old stone. At the bottom they found themselves in a narrow corridor that stretched away into impenetrable blackness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, and Jason could hear the faint sound of their own breathing echoing off the walls. "This way," Callista breathed, taking his hand. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes when the sound reached them. A low rumble that seemed to come from the very stones around them. At first, Jason thought it might be thunder, but then he realized what it was. The wooden horse was being opened. Above them, Troy was waking up to find enemy soldiers pouring through their streets. Jason could hear shouting now, distant but growing closer. The clash of weapons, the first screams. "Run!" he whispered to Callista. They stumbled through the darkness, no longer caring about stealth. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew louder. Smoke began to seep down into the tunnel, and Jason realized that the Greeks had started setting fires. Troy was burning. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. Jason's lungs burned and his legs ached, but he forced himself to keep moving. Callista gasped beside him, her hand squeezing his so tightly he thought she might break his fingers. Then finally he saw it, a faint glow ahead that could only be starlight. The tunnel ended in a grate of rusty iron bars. Callista produced a key from somewhere in her tunic and unlocked it with shaking hands. They crawled through into a grove of ancient olive trees, their silver leaves rustling in the night breeze. From here they could see Troy burning. Flames rose from dozens of buildings, and the sky glowed red with reflected fire. Greek warriors moved through the streets like ants, methodically looting and destroying everything in their path. The screams of the dying carried across the fields. "My city," Callista whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My beautiful city." Jason put his arm around her shoulders, feeling helpless in the face of such destruction. This was history, he told himself. It had already happened, thousands of years ago. But that didn't make it hurt any less to watch. A sound behind them made them both turn. A Greek warrior stood at the edge of the grove, his bronze armour gleaming in the firelight. He held a spear in one hand and a sword in the other, both weapons already dark with blood. "Well, well," he said in accented Greek that Jason somehow understood perfectly. "Two little mice trying to escape the trap." The warrior raised his spear and Jason knew they were going to die. Then something strange happened. The air behind the Greek began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. A golden glow spread through the olive trees, growing brighter by the second. "The rift," Jason breathed. "It's opening again." He could see it now, a tear in reality itself that showed glimpses of another world beyond. The Metropolitan Museum. Fluorescent lights, the sound of school groups echoing through marble halls. The Greek warrior lunged with his spear. Jason threw himself sideways, grabbing Callista and pulling her toward the rift. The bronze point grazed his arm, sending fire shooting through his shoulder, but he didn't stop moving. "Jump!" he shouted. They leaped together into the golden light, but at the last second Callista pulled back. "I can't," she cried. "My family! They might still be alive. I have to try to find them." Her hand slipped from his as Jason tumbled through the rift alone. The last thing he saw was her face, streaked with tears but set with determination, as she turned back toward the burning city. Jason landed hard on cold marble. his shoulder throbbing where the spear had cut him. The smell of wood smoke and death was replaced by the sterile scent of museum air. Around him, glass cases displayed their ancient treasures under perfect lighting, and somewhere in the distance he could hear Ms. Henderson counting heads. He was back. Jason sat up slowly, his head spinning. His shirt was torn and blood-stained, and his hands were black with soot from the tunnel. But when he looked around, everything in the gallery was exactly as he'd left it. The golden cup sat in its case, innocent and beautiful, giving no sign of the horrors it had shown him. "Jason, there you are!" Ms. Henderson's voice echoed across the hall. "We've been looking everywhere for you. The bus is loading." He climbed to his feet on unsteady legs, trying to think of an explanation that wouldn't land him in the school counsellor's office. "Sorry, I got lost looking at the exhibits." Ms. Henderson frowned at his dishevelled appearance but didn't comment. "Well, come along then, and next time stay with the group." As they walked toward the exit, Jason found himself looking back at the Trojan display. For just a moment the golden cup seemed to flicker within a light, and he could swear he heard the distant sound of flames and screaming. But then the moment passed, and it was just a museum artifact again, beautiful and mysterious and safely contained behind glass. On the bus ride back to school, Jason stared out the window and thought about Callista. Had she found her family in the burning city? Had she survived the night? He would never know, and that uncertainty was almost worse than knowing she had died. At least the historians were certain about one thing. No one had survived Troy's fall. The city had been completely destroyed, its people killed or enslaved. But sometimes, Jason told himself, historians were wrong. Sometimes there were survivors whose stories simply hadn't been recorded. Sometimes brave girls who worked in palace kitchens found ways to save the people they loved, even when the whole world was falling down around them. He touched his wounded shoulder, feeling the ache of the spear cut, and knew that whatever else happened, he would never forget the Trojan feast. The weight of witnessing history, of seeing the human cost of events that had become just stories in textbooks, would stay with him forever. As the bus pulled into Lincoln High's parking lot, Jason made himself a promise. He would study harder, learn more, understand better. Because history wasn't just about dates and battles and the rise and fall of civilizations, it was about people. Real people with real lives and real dreams who deserved to be remembered for more than just how they died. The Golden Cup was waiting for him, he knew, calling to him across time and space, offering more journeys to distant worlds and ancient times. But Jason also knew that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again. The past had claimed a piece of his heart, and he would spend the rest of his life wondering about all the stories that had been lost to time. In his backpack, safely hidden beneath textbooks and notebooks, was a small piece of charcoal he'd picked up in the tunnel, the only proof he had that his journey had been real. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and hold it, remembering the smell of burning Troy and the sound of Callista's voice saying she couldn't leave her family behind. It was a reminder that history was never just about the past. It lived on in memory and story, in the choices people made and the prices they paid for love and loyalty and hope. And sometimes, if you were very unlucky or very blessed, it reached out across the centuries to touch you directly, changing you forever with the weight of all those vanished lives. The Trojan feast had ended long ago, but its echoes would follow Jason Ward for the rest of his days. Elena Voss pressed her fingers against her temples, feeling the familiar ache that came after 12 hours bent over a canvas. The conservation wing of the Musée d'Orsay fell silent around her at this hour, the tourists and staff long gone, leaving only the hum of climate control systems and the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. She preferred it this way. No interruptions, no colleagues peering over her shoulder, no museum directors asking when the restoration would be complete. The painting before her stretched nearly 3 meters across, its ornate gilded frame requiring a small scaffold to reach the upper portions. The Battle of Austerlitz, by Jean-Baptiste Isabey, had arrived from a private collection in deplorable condition. Centuries of neglect, amateur touch-ups and environmental damage had left the canvas brittle and discoloured. What should have been Napoleon's greatest victory rendered in vivid detail had become a muddy, cracked landscape of indistinct figures. Elena had been working on it for 6 months now, slowly revealing the original brilliance beneath layers of grime and overpaint. The museum's meagre restoration budget meant she worked alone, with outdated equipment and insufficient pay, but she loved the detective work of it, uncovering the artist's original intention stroke by careful stroke. Tonight she was working on the central portion, where smoke from cannon fire should have been billowing across the battlefield. The paint had lifted in several places, creating dangerous flakes that threatened to fall away entirely. She selected her finest scalpel, steadying her hand against the canvas as she began to separate a stubborn piece of 19th century varnish from the original paint beneath. The blade moved smoothly at first, following the natural cracks in the aged medium. Eleanor had done this thousands of times before, the gentle pressure, the precise angle, the careful control. But something was different about this paint layer. It felt almost alive under her touch. The canvas seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. She leaned closer, adjusting the magnifying glass attached to her headband. The brushstrokes beneath the grime were extraordinary. She could see individual hairs in the horses' manes, the weave of fabric in the soldiers' uniforms, the crystalline structure of snow caught mid-fall. Isabey had been more skilled than she'd realised. The scalpel moved deeper, separating what should have been the final layer of foreign material. But instead of revealing the expected paint surface, she felt the blade pierce completely through. A sharp crack echoed through the conservation lab as the brittle canvas gave way. "Merde," she whispered, pulling back in horror. A jagged tear now ran diagonally across the central portion of the painting, roughly the length of her hand. 20 years of restoration experience, and she'd never made such a careless mistake. The museum director would have her fired by morning. But as she stared at the damage, something impossible caught her attention. Instead of seeing the backing canvas or the wall behind the painting, the tear seemed to open onto something else entirely. Snow was falling through the gap, real snow, cold and wet, landing on her work table and instantly melting. A blast of frigid air hit her face, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder, and something else she didn't want to identify. Eleanor stumbled backward, knocking over her chair. The sounds coming from the tear were unmistakable. The thunder of cannon fire, the screaming of horses, men shouting in what sounded like French and Russian. Through the gap she could glimpse a winter sky choked with smoke, the flash of metal, figures moving frantically across snow-covered ground. This was impossible. She was hallucinating from exhaustion, from too many late nights and too much paint fume exposure. She reached for her phone to call for help, but stopped when she heard something else through the tear. The rapid beating of drums, urgent and desperate, growing closer. Against every rational instinct, Eleanor moved toward the painting. The tear had widened slightly as if responding to her approach. She could see more clearly now. Soldiers in early 19th century uniforms stumbling through knee-deep snow. Cavalry charging with sabres raised. Artillery pieces being dragged into position by teams of men and horses. It was the Battle of Austerlitz exactly as Isabey had painted it. Except this was no static image. This was real, alive, happening. She reached out tentatively, her fingers approaching the edge of the tear. The moment her hand crossed the threshold, she felt an irresistible pulling sensation, as if the painting were drawing her in. The conservation lab tilted and spun around her, fluorescent lights becoming swirling snow, marble floors becoming frozen mud. Eleanor landed hard on her stomach, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. Icy water immediately soaked through her clothes as she struggled to her hands and knees. The sounds she'd heard through the tear now surrounded her completely. The roar of cannons, the clash of steel, the screams of wounded men and animals. The air burned her throat with the smell of gunpowder, blood and death. A massive shadow passed over her, and she looked up to see a cavalry horse leaping above her head, its hooves barely missing her skull. The rider, a French cuirassier with a bloody sabre, didn't even notice her as he galloped toward a group of Russian infantry forming a square in the distance. Eleanor rolled to her right just as another horse thundered past, this one riderless and wild with terror. She scrambled to her feet, her conservation lab clothes, black slacks and a white cotton blouse, completely inadequate for the December cold of 1805. Her breath came in sharp white puffs as she tried to orient herself. The battlefield stretched in all directions, a hellscape of snow, smoke and carnage. To her left, French artillery crews were loading their guns, the bronze barrels gleaming wetly in the dim light. To her right, she could see the distinctive white uniforms of Austrian troops retreating in disorder. Straight ahead, through the drifting smoke, she glimpsed the outline of the Pratzen Heights where Napoleon himself was supposedly directing the battle. But something was wrong. Elena knew this painting intimately. She'd studied every square centimetre for months. The scene around her didn't match what Isabey had captured. The flag that should have been raised prominently in the centre of the composition was still furled and lying in the snow. The general who should have been pointing dramatically toward the enemy lines was instead crouched behind an overturned cannon, blood streaming from a wound in his forehead. The smoke that should have been curling in elegant spirals was instead a chaotic wall of grey obscuring everything. She was in the right battle, but at the wrong moment. The scene Isabey had chosen to immortalise hadn't happened yet. Mademoiselle, qu'est-ce que vous faites ici? Elena turned to find a young soldier approaching her, his blue uniform marking him as French. He couldn't have been more than 16, with the soft features of a boy who'd never needed to shave. A drum hung from his shoulder by a leather strap, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. I don't... Elena's French was rusty from years of disuse, but she forced herself to respond. I am lost. I was looking for the wounded. The boy nodded quickly. You're an infirmière? A nurse? You should not be here, mademoiselle. This sector is under heavy fire. Come, I will help you find the medical tents. He took her arm gently but firmly, leading her away from the worst of the fighting. As they walked, he kept glancing around nervously, flinching each time a cannonball whistled overhead. What is your name? Elena asked. Luc Moreau, mademoiselle, drummer boy of the 4th Line Infantry. And you? Hélène, she corrected herself quickly. How long has the battle been going on? Luc looked at her strangely. Since dawn, mademoiselle. It is now past midday. Did you strike your head? You seem confused. Elena touched her forehead and found a small cut there, probably from her fall. Perhaps everything seems different. The battle goes well for us, Luc said, with the forced optimism of a young soldier trying to convince himself as much as her. The Emperor's plan is working. The Austrians and Russians took the heights this morning, just as he wanted. Soon we will spring the trap. They passed a field hospital set up in the ruins of a stone farmhouse. Elena's stomach turned as she saw the reality that no painting could capture. Surgeons working without anaesthesia, piles of amputated limbs growing in the snow, men screaming for water or their mothers or a bullet to end their suffering. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the acrid smoke created a nauseating cocktail that made her dizzy. I need to go back, she said suddenly, to where you found me. Mademoiselle, that is the most dangerous part of the field. The cavalry charges. I left something there, something important. Eleanor gripped his arm. Please, Luc, I must find it. The boy studied her face, then nodded reluctantly. I will take you as far as I can, but when the drums sound the advance, I must return to my regiment. They retraced their steps through the chaos, passing artillery crews, supply wagons stuck in the mud, and endless streams of wounded making their way to the rear. Eleanor tried to memorize every detail, knowing somehow that she would need this information later. The way the snow fell in thick, wet flakes that melted instantly on the warm gun barrels, the particular shade of blue-grey in the smoke, the angle of the winter light filtering through the overcast sky. As they approached the area where Elena had first appeared, she began looking for any sign of the tear that had brought her here. There had to be a way back, some shimmering in the air, some distortion in the landscape, but she saw nothing except snow, smoke and soldiers. There, Luc pointed through the drifting smoke. The scene is forming. Eleanor followed his gaze and felt her heart leap. Through a momentary gap in the gun smoke, she could see the exact composition she knew from the painting. The general was rising from behind the overturned cannon, raising his sword toward the enemy positions. A group of grenadiers was moving into position behind him, their bearskin hats distinctive even at a distance. And there, lying in the snow just where it should be, was the tricolour flag that would soon be raised in defiant triumph. I need to see it closer, Elena said, starting toward the forming tableau. Non. Luc grabbed her wrist. Mademoiselle, the Austrian cavalry is massing for a charge. See there, on the ridge? In moments this entire area will be a killing ground. He was right. Eleanor could see the white uniformed horsemen gathering on a low hill to the east. their curved sabres glinting in the pale light. But she also knew that this was the moment, the exact scene that Isabey had chosen to paint. If she was going to find her way back, she needed to understand every detail of this composition. "How long do I have?" "Minutes, maybe less. When their horns sound the charge." Elena looked around desperately, searching for anything that might serve as shelter or vantage point. Her eyes fell on a damaged artillery caisson about 50 metres from where the scene was forming. If she could reach it, she might be able to observe safely. "Luke, do you have paper? Anything I could write with?" The boy reached into his cartridge pouch and produced a small notebook and a stub of pencil. "For messages," he explained, "but I also draw sometimes when the fighting stops." Elena took the notebook gratefully and sprinted toward the caisson, leaving Luke behind. The wooden vehicle had been shattered by cannon fire, but one side remained intact, providing cover from the east where the Austrian cavalry was forming. She crouched behind it and opened the notebook, her hands shaking from both cold and adrenaline. The scene was perfect now. The general, she could see his face clearly, a man of perhaps 40 with greying hair and fierce dark eyes, stood atop a small rise, his sword pointing directly at the enemy lines. The grenadiers had fallen into formation behind him, their bayonets fixed, their faces grim with determination. One of them was bending to retrieve the fallen flag. Eleanor began sketching frantically, trying to capture not just the positions of the figures, but their expressions, the way the light fell on their uniforms, the specific pattern the smoke made as it drifted across the scene. Her art training took over, her hand moving with practiced precision despite the cold and the chaos around her. But as she drew, she realised the scene was beginning to shift again. The flag-bearer was moving too slowly, distracted by a wounded comrade. The general was turning his head to look at something behind him. The light was changing as the smoke thickened. The Austrian horns sounded their charge. Elena looked up to see the white-coated cavalry thundering down from the ridge, their sabres raised, their horses' hooves throwing up clouds of snow and dirt. They would reach the French position in less than a minute, and when they did, the careful composition would be shattered. Without thinking, Eleanor stood up from behind the caisson and began running toward the flag-bearer. She could hear Luke shouting her name behind her, could hear the drumming of hooves growing louder, but she focused only on reaching the tricolour before the cavalry did. The young grenadier who was supposed to raise the flag had stopped to help his wounded comrade, leaving the banner lying abandoned in the snow. Eleanor reached it just as the first Austrian horseman crested the rise above them. "The flag!" she screamed at the grenadier in French. "Raise the flag!" The soldier looked at her in confusion, then at the approaching cavalry. Understanding dawned in his eyes, and he abandoned his wounded comrade to die for the tricolour, but a sabre cut took him across the shoulder as he reached for it, spinning him around and sending him sprawling. Elena grabbed the flag herself and thrust it toward Luke, who had followed her despite the danger. "Here, we must raise it, just like in the painting." "What painting? Mademoiselle, we must run." "Please!" Elena's voice broke with desperation. "Exactly there, where the general can see it. Please, Luke." The boy took the flag without understanding, his face pale with terror as the Austrian cavalry swept down on them. He raised it high, just as Elena had indicated, the tricolour snapping proudly in the winter wind. The tableau was perfect now. The general with his sword raised, the grenadiers in formation, Luke with the flag held high against the smoke-darkened sky. Eleanor committed every detail to memory in the few seconds before the cavalry reached them. She saw the sabre coming toward Luke before he did. Without thinking, she threw herself sideways, knocking him to the ground just as the Austrian blade whistled through the space where his head had been. The flag fell with them, but the scene was already burned into her memory. Luke cried out as they hit the ground, and Elena saw blood spreading across his chest. The sabre had caught him as they fell, opening a deep gash from his shoulder to his ribs. His young face was already pale with shock. "Luke!" Eleanor pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, but she could feel his life running out between her fingers. "Stay with me!" The boy's eyes found hers, confused and frightened. "Mademoiselle, why did you—" "I'm sorry," Elena whispered. "I'm so sorry." Luke's hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "The drum. Take my drum. Tell them I did my duty." He died with the tricolour flag clutched in his free hand, his blood soaking into the snow beneath them. Eleanor knelt beside his body as the battle raged around her, Austrian and French cavalry clashing above them, the general and his grenadiers fighting desperately to hold their position. She had seen the scene. She had memorised every detail. But the cost. Eleanor forced herself to stand, Luke's blood on her hands and clothes. She needed to find the tear, needed to get back to her own time before she was killed as well. But where was it? She had appeared near here, but the landscape had been transformed by the fighting. Cannon craters had altered the terrain, smoke-obscured landmarks, and bodies lay everywhere in the snow. She began searching frantically, running back and forth across the battlefield as bullets whistled around her. There had to be some sign, some shimmer in the air, some distortion that marked the passage between worlds. A cannonball struck the ground near her feet, showering her with frozen earth and slush. The impact knocked her backward, and as she fell, she saw it. A patch of air that seemed to ripple like water, barely visible through the smoke and snow. It was perhaps 20 metres away, near a cluster of dead horses. Eleanor ran as she'd never run before, her lungs burning with the cold air and gunpowder smoke. Behind her, she could hear French voices shouting orders, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of wounded men and animals. A musket ball tugged at her sleeve, another whistled past her ear. The shimmer in the air grew more distinct as she approached. It was exactly the size and shape of the tear she'd created in the painting, hanging about 2 metres above the ground like a window into another world. Through it she could glimpse the familiar fluorescent lighting of the conservation lab. Eleanor leaped, diving head first through the gap between worlds. She landed hard on the marble floor of the museum, her body aching from the impact and the cold. The sudden silence was deafening after the chaos of the battlefield. No cannons, no screams, no clash of weapons, only the gentle hum of the climate control system and her own laboured breathing. Elena struggled to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion and shock. The conservation lab looked exactly as she had left it. Her tools scattered on the work table, the overturned chair, the powerful lights illuminating her workspace. But the painting had changed. The tear was gone, sealed as if it had never existed. But more significantly, the entire central portion of the canvas was now blank, a void of white primer where the battle scene should have been. Eleanor stared at it in horror, realising what this meant. She had been transported to the actual battle, but in returning she had somehow erased the painted image from the canvas. She was the only one who knew what the scene had looked like. She was the only one who could restore it. Eleanor's hands shook as she prepared her paints, mixing colours with the desperate precision of someone whose career and sanity depended on getting every detail exactly right. Burnt umber for the winter sky, titanium white mixed with a touch of ultramarine for the snow, cadmium red deep mixed with burnt sienna for the blood. She began with the background, laying in the smoke-darkened sky and the distant hills where the Russian and Austrian armies had positioned themselves. Then the middle ground, the artillery pieces, the overturned caisson, the scattered equipment of war. Each brushstroke brought back memories of the battle, the sounds and smells and terrible reality of it. As she worked, Eleanor found herself crying. For Luke, for all the young men who had died in that frozen field, for the innocence she had lost in those few hours of war. Her tears fell onto the palette, mixing with the pigments, becoming part of the painting itself. The figures came next. The general with his sword raised, his face set in lines of determination and command. The grenadiers in their blue uniforms and bearskin hats, their bayonets gleaming in the pale light. And there, in the corner where the historical record would never note his presence, a young drummer boy holding the tricolour flag high against the smoke-filled sky. Eleanor painted Luke's face from memory, every detail burned into her consciousness. His wide, frightened eyes, the soft curve of his adolescent features, the way his mouth was set in a line of desperate courage. She painted him as she had seen him in those final moments, young, brave and dying for a cause he barely understood. The work consumed her completely. She forgot about time, about hunger, about anything except the need to capture the scene exactly as she had witnessed it. Each brushstroke had to be perfect, each colour precisely matched to her memory. This wasn't just restoration anymore, it was resurrection, bringing back to life a moment that existed nowhere else in the world. Dawn was breaking over Paris when Eleanor finally stepped back from the easel. The painting was complete, the battle scene restored in all its terrible glory. But it was more than just a restoration. It was the most accurate depiction of the Battle of Austerlitz ever created, painted by the only person who had ever witnessed both the battle itself and Isabey's original vision. She cleaned her brushes with mechanical precision, her mind still processing what she had experienced. Had it been real? The blood on her clothes suggested it was, though she could hardly believe it herself. The notebook Luke had given her was still in her pocket, filled with her frantic sketches of the battlefield. Eleanor took one final look at the painting before covering it with the conservation cloth. In the corner, Luke's painted eyes seemed to meet hers, and she thought she saw understanding there. Forgiveness, perhaps, for the choice she had been forced to make. 3 weeks later, the restored Battle of Austerlitz was unveiled to great fanfare in the museum's main gallery. Art critics praised Elena's work, noting the extraordinary lifelike quality of the battle scene, and particularly commenting on the young drummer boy in the corner, whose face seemed to embody the tragedy and heroism of war. "The expression in that boy's eyes," wrote one reviewer, "captures something profound about the human cost of Napoleon's ambitions. One feels that Isabey must have witnessed such scenes himself. So vivid and immediate is the emotion conveyed." Eleanor read the reviews with a mixture of pride and pain. She had been promoted, given a raise, offered positions at prestigious institutions around the world, but none of that mattered compared to the weight she carried. She stood before the painting during visiting hours sometimes, watching tourists and scholars admire the work. They saw the glory of battle, the triumph of French arms, the artistic genius of the long-dead painter. They couldn't see what Eleanor saw, the reality behind the romantic vision, the individual cost of collective glory, the young man who had died so that art could live. Every night Eleanor dreamed of snow and smoke and the sound of drums fading into silence. In her dreams she could still hear Luke's voice asking why she had chosen the painting over his life. She never had an answer that satisfied either of them, but the painting lived, perfectly restored, exactly as it had been intended. And in the corner, immortalized in oil and varnish, Luc Moreau held his flag high for all eternity, his young face a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the terrible price of perfection. Eleanor Voss kept her secret, as she knew she always would. Some truths were too impossible to share, too precious to risk. She had crossed between worlds, witnessed history, and made choices that would haunt her forever. The painting was her testimony, her confession, and her penance all in one. And sometimes, late at night in the conservation lab, she would touch the surface of the canvas and whisper an apology to a boy who would be forever 16, forever brave, forever holding his flag against the smoke-darkened sky of Austerlitz. The Mediterranean sun filtered through 30 metres of crystalline water, casting wavering shadows across the sunken temple's weathered columns. Dr. Caleb Rourke adjusted his diving mask and checked his pressure gauge. Still plenty of air for another 20 minutes of exploration. This was the discovery of a lifetime. A previously unknown temple complex off the coast of modern Delphi, revealed only after last winter's unprecedented storms had shifted the seafloor. Caleb's fins stirred up ancient silt as he manoeuvred through the temple's central chamber. His underwater camera clicked steadily, documenting every carved relief, every fragment of pottery embedded in the coral-encrusted walls. The structure was remarkably preserved, its Doric columns still standing proud despite millennia beneath the waves. Marine archaeology had been his passion since graduate school, but nothing had prepared him for this, a temple that predated the famous oracle sanctuary above by centuries. At the chamber's heart lay an altar unlike any he'd seen in textbooks. Concentric circles spiralled inward toward the centre, carved with such precision that they seemed to pulse with their own rhythm in the dancing light. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each groove perfectly measured, each symbol deliberately placed. Caleb circled the altar slowly, photographing from every angle, when something metallic caught his eye. Wedged between two coral formations, almost hidden by centuries of marine growth, was the hilt of what appeared to be a ceremonial dagger. The bronze beneath the incrustation gleamed dully, and intricate patterns were still visible along its length. Caleb's heart raced. Artifacts this well preserved were extraordinarily rare. He reached for his collection bag, then hesitated. Proper protocol demanded marking the location and returning with a full archaeological team, but the excitement of discovery overrode his caution. The dagger came free more easily than expected, coral crumbling away to reveal an ornate blade inscribed with symbols that seemed oddly familiar yet completely alien. As Caleb turned it over in his gloved hands, examining the inscriptions, the blade's edge caught on his palm where his diving glove had torn on an earlier dive. The cut was shallow but immediate, a thin line of blood seeping through the neoprene. Before he could react, several drops of blood fell onto the altar's surface, landing precisely in the centre of the concentric circles. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The carved grooves began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun above. The altar itself started to vibrate, sending tremors through the water that Caleb felt in his bones. The water around him grew warm, then hot, then scalding. Panic flooded his system as his diving computer began beeping frantically, its display showing impossible readings. The temperature gauge climbed beyond its maximum range. Through his mask, Caleb watched in horror as the water itself began to change, transforming from the familiar blue-green of the Mediterranean to a brilliant, blinding white that seared his retinas. He tried to swim upward, to escape whatever was happening, but the light was everywhere now, consuming the temple, the seafloor, even the darkness above. His breathing apparatus felt like it was feeding him molten air. The last coherent thought before consciousness left him was a desperate prayer to whatever gods might be listening. A prayer that would prove more consequential than he could ever imagine. Caleb's return to awareness came not gradually, but like a physical blow. One moment he was drowning in light, the next he was gasping and choking, salt water pouring from his lungs as he struggled to his hands and knees. But this wasn't the sandy bottom of the Mediterranean. Beneath his palms was rough stone, and the water around him was shallow, barely reaching his waist. He looked up, expecting to see his research vessel's hull above him, to hear the concerned voices of his dive crew. Instead, he found himself staring at a harbour unlike any in the modern world. Wooden ships with painted eyes on their prows bobbed at anchor, their hulls curved and elegant in ways that belonged to another era entirely. Men in short tunics and sandals worked the docks, their voices carrying across the water in a language that sounded like Greek, but not quite the Greek he'd studied in university. Caleb struggled to his feet, water streaming from his wetsuit. The diving gear that had been his lifeline moments before now marked him as something impossible, something that didn't belong. A crowd was gathering on the shore, pointing and speaking in rapid, excited bursts. Their clothing was simple but well made. Linen tunics dyed in earth tones, leather sandals, bronze jewellery that caught the morning sun. But it was their faces that struck him most. The way they looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear, as if he were some creature stepped out of their oldest myths. An elderly man with a magnificent white beard pushed through the crowd, his bearing suggesting authority despite his simple robes. When he spoke, his words carried the cadence of ancient ritual. Tiestin tuto, poseltes ectes thalasis. Caleb's university Greek was rusty and focused on reading ancient texts, not conversation, but he caught enough to understand. What is this? How came you from the sea? He tried to respond, but his modern pronunciation and limited vocabulary marked him immediately as foreign, as other. The crowd's murmurs grew more agitated, and he caught scattered words. Daemon, theos, polemos, demon, god, war. His diving equipment was drawing the most attention. The old man approached cautiously, reaching out to touch the black neoprene of Caleb's wetsuit as if it might burn him. When his fingers encountered the strange material, he jerked back and began speaking rapidly to the crowd. Caleb didn't need perfect translation to understand the fear in their voices. A younger man, muscular and bearing the scars of a warrior, stepped forward. His hand rested on the hilt of a sword and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had killed before. Athenios, Lacedaemonios? He demanded. Athenian? Or Spartan? The question hit Caleb like a physical blow. History rushed back to him. His knowledge of the ancient world, of the devastating war that had torn Greece apart in the 5th century BCE. If he had somehow, impossibly, travelled back to that time, then this simple question was a matter of life and death. Choosing the wrong side, or being unable to choose at all, could see him executed as a spy. "Uke mi polits," he managed to say in his halting ancient Greek. "I am not a citizen." It was perhaps the most important phrase he could have chosen. In the ancient world, citizenship was everything, but foreign merchants and craftsmen could often travel between city-states without being seen as threats. The warrior's eyes narrowed, but he didn't draw his sword. Instead, he barked something to the crowd that Caleb couldn't follow. Within moments, strong hands seized his arms, and he found himself being marched away from the harbour, still dripping seawater, still wearing his impossible diving gear. They brought him to what appeared to be a market square, where a man of obvious importance sat in the shade of a colonnade. His chiton was finer than the others, dyed a deep purple that spoke of wealth and status. Gold rings adorned his fingers, and a wreath of olive leaves crowned his greying hair. This was clearly a man of authority, perhaps an archon or other civic official. The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in rapid Greek, far beyond Caleb's ability to follow. He caught fragments. The words for sea, stranger, and omen featured prominently. The official's eyes never left Caleb's face as the crowd recounted what they had witnessed. Finally, the man raised his hand for silence and addressed Caleb directly. "You understand our tongue?" he asked in Greek, speaking slowly and clearly. "A little," Caleb replied honestly. "I am traveller from far land." The official's eyebrows rose. "Your accent is strange, and these garments—" He gestured to the wetsuit. What manner of craft produced such things? Caleb's mind raced. How could he possibly explain synthetic materials or diving equipment, or any aspect of the modern world? "My people have different ways," he said finally. It was weak, but it was all he could manage. The interrogation continued for what felt like hours. Caleb learned that he was in Naupactus, a port city allied with Athens. The year, as near as he could determine from their calendar references, was somewhere around 425 BCE, the height of the Peloponnesian War. The very air seemed thick with tension and suspicion. These people lived in a world where any stranger might be an enemy agent, where the wrong word could trigger a cascade of violence that would consume entire cities. His modern equipment was taken from him: diving mask, fins, his underwater camera, which they handled with superstitious care as if it might curse them. In exchange, he was given a rough woolen tunic and sandals that were too small. The transformation was jarring. One moment he had been doctor, Caleb Rourke, marine archaeologist, equipped with the finest technology of the 21st century. The next he was a nameless foreigner in clothes that scratched his skin, trying to convince ancient Greeks that he wasn't a threat. But survival in this world required more than just looking the part. As the days passed, Caleb realised that his greatest asset wasn't his modern knowledge of technology, but his understanding of the ancient world itself. His archaeological training had given him insights into everything from construction techniques to trade routes, from religious practices to military tactics. Knowledge that seemed academic in his own time was suddenly practical, even life-saving. He began to present himself as a travelling stonemason and surveyor. The skills weren't entirely fabricated. His work as a marine archaeologist had required understanding of structural engineering, of how ancient builders had created their monuments. When a local merchant complained about a foundation that kept settling, Caleb was able to suggest drainage techniques that were centuries ahead of their time, but which he presented as wisdom learned from masters in distant lands. Word of his abilities spread quickly. Within a week, he was consulted on everything from harbour improvements to aqueduct repairs. His knowledge of geometry and mathematics, advanced by ancient standards but elementary by his own, seemed almost magical to people who relied on crude approximations. When he helped design a more efficient loading system for the harbour cranes, using principles of mechanical advantage that wouldn't be formally codified for generations, the portmaster declared him touched by Athena herself. But with recognition came danger. His innovations attracted attention not just from grateful merchants, but from military minds who saw strategic applications. An Athenian trireme captain, impressed by Caleb's modifications to his ship's rigging, began asking pointed questions about naval warfare in foreign lands. What new tactics had Caleb observed? What improvements to ship design? How did distant navies address the problem of ramming attacks? Caleb walked a careful line, sharing enough knowledge to maintain his cover while avoiding anything that might significantly alter the course of history. He had no idea if changes to the timeline were possible or what consequences they might have, but the responsibility felt enormous. Every innovation he introduced, every piece of advice he gave, could ripple forward through the centuries in ways he couldn't predict. The moral complexity of his situation struck him most forcefully when he was consulted about siege weapons. An Athenian engineer, designing catapults for an upcoming campaign, sought his input on improving their range and accuracy. Caleb found himself caught between his need to maintain his cover and his reluctance to contribute to ancient warfare. The knowledge he possessed could save or destroy thousands of lives, could alter the outcome of battles that had shaped Western civilization. In the end, he offered only minor improvements, adjustments to the torsion springs that would increase accuracy, but not fundamentally change the weapon's capabilities. It felt like a compromise with history itself, a way of honouring his commitment to the timeline while still playing the role necessary for survival. As his reputation grew, so did the risks. Rumours began to circulate about the strange craftsman who had emerged from the sea with impossible knowledge. Some called him blessed by the gods, others whispered that he was a demon in human form, sent to corrupt honest Greek craftsmanship with foreign sorcery. The distinction mattered little in practical terms. Both divine favour and supernatural curse made him a target for those who sought to use his abilities or eliminate his influence. The political situation deteriorated daily. News arrived of Athenian defeats, of Spartan raids coming ever closer to the coast. Refugees flooded into Naupactus, bringing tales of burned villages and enslaved populations. The city's defences were strengthened, and suspicious scrutiny fell on every foreign face. Caleb's carefully constructed identity as a neutral craftsman became increasingly untenable as the war's demands grew more absolute. It was during this time of mounting tension that he first heard mention of Delphi. A group of merchants preparing to make the dangerous journey inland to consult the oracle about their trading prospects spoke of troubles at the sacred site. Spartan raiders had been active in the region, they said, stealing temple treasures and interfering with pilgrim traffic. Most disturbing of all were reports that a sacred bronze disc, one of Apollo's most precious artefacts, had been taken during a recent raid. The mention of a bronze disc sent a chill through Caleb's soul. He pressed the merchants for details, claiming professional interest in sacred metalwork. What they described, a disc inscribed with concentric circles, used in the oracle's most sacred rituals, sounded remarkably similar to the altar he'd found beneath the waves. More than similar, it sounded like the same design, the same sacred geometry that had somehow transported him across the centuries. That night, unable to sleep in his small rented room above a potter's shop, Caleb made a decision that would change everything. If there was any chance of returning to his own time, it lay with understanding the connection between the sunken altar and the oracle of Delphi. The bronze disc stolen by the Spartans might be the key he needed, not just to solve the mystery of his transportation, but to reverse it. The journey to Delphi would be perilous beyond imagining. The roads were contested territory, haunted by bandits and military patrols from both sides. A lone traveller, especially one with Caleb's uncertain accent and foreign manner, would be an easy target for suspicion or violence. But staying in Naupactus was becoming equally dangerous as the war closed in, and his own anomalous presence drew ever more attention. He began to prepare carefully, trading his specialised knowledge for the supplies he would need. A grateful ship captain, whose vessel Caleb had helped modify for better speed and handling, provided a travelling pack and supplies. A merchant whose warehouse foundation Caleb had saved from collapse offered silver coins, enough to buy passage with a caravan, if he could find one willing to risk the journey. The opportunity came sooner than expected, in the form of Lysander, a middle-aged trader with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades moving goods between the Greek city-states. His caravan was small but well-armed, consisting of 3 wagons loaded with pottery and textiles, guarded by a half-dozen tough-looking mercenaries. Lysander was planning to risk the journey to Thebes, passing close enough to Delphi that Caleb could break off and make his own way to the sacred site. "You're either very brave or very foolish," Lysander told him as they negotiated Caleb's passage. "The roads are crawling with soldiers on both sides, and they're all nervous about spies. A man travelling alone with your distinctive manner of speech You'll be lucky to make it 10 miles. But Lysander needed Caleb's skills as much as Caleb needed his caravan. The trader had been having persistent problems with his wagon wheels, a design flaw that Caleb could easily correct using principles of load distribution that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. In exchange for his expertise, Lysander agreed to take him as far as the crossroads near Delphi, where pilgrim paths branched off from the main trade route. The morning of their departure, Caleb stood at the edge of Naupactus harbour, looking out at the same waters from which he had emerged weeks earlier. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, hiding beneath its surface the sunken temple that held the key to his predicament. Somewhere down there, in his own time, his research team was probably searching desperately for his body, wondering how their colleague had simply vanished during what should have been a routine dive. The thought of his modern life, his university position, his research, the comfortable predictability of the 21st century felt both infinitely distant and heartbreakingly close. He had friends who would mourn his disappearance, projects left unfinished, a small apartment in Athens that would stand empty while his mail piled up and his plants withered. The life he had built seemed as fragile as sea foam now, dissolved by forces he barely understood, but dwelling on what he had lost wouldn't help him find a way back. With a final look at the harbour where his impossible journey had begun, Caleb shouldered his pack and joined Lysander's caravan as it began its dangerous trek inland. The road to Thebes wound through some of the most contested territory in Greece. Ancient paths that had been peaceful trade routes for generations were now potential battlefields, where armies could clash without warning and travellers could find themselves caught between opposing forces. The caravan moved carefully, stopping frequently to send scouts ahead and listen for signs of military activity. Caleb's modern sensibilities were unprepared for the casual brutality of travel in the ancient world. They passed burned farmsteads where families had been killed or enslaved, their bodies left unburied to feed the crows. Refugees streamed along the roads in both directions, carrying what few possessions they could salvage, their faces hollow with loss and fear. The war wasn't just a conflict between city-states, it was a catastrophe that touched every life in Greece. On their third day out from Naupactus, they encountered their first military patrol, a unit of Athenian hoplites moving south toward the Peloponnese. The bronze of their shields and spear points gleamed in the afternoon sun, and their disciplined formation spoke of professional soldiers at the height of their training. These were the men who had fought at Marathon and Thermopylae, the heirs to Greece's greatest military traditions. The patrol's captain, a scarred veteran with intelligent eyes, questioned Lysander closely about his cargo and destination. His gaze lingered on Caleb, taking in the subtle foreignness of his appearance and manner. When the captain addressed him directly, asking about his homeland and business, Caleb's carefully rehearsed answers felt thin and inadequate. "Your Greek is unusual," the captain observed. "Where did you say you learned it?" "From traders," Caleb replied, sticking to his cover story. "My people deal much with Greek merchants," the captain's eyes narrowed. "And what people would those be exactly?" It was Lysander who saved him, stepping forward with the easy confidence of a man who had talked his way past countless checkpoints. "He's a stoneworker, Captain. Been helping me with some wheel problems. Has a knack for it. You know how these foreign craftsmen are. They all have their little secrets." The captain studied Caleb for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "See that you keep your secrets to yourself, foreigner. These are dangerous times for those who can't prove their loyalties." As the patrol moved on, Caleb felt sweat cooling on his back despite the warm afternoon. How many more such encounters would he face? How long could his thin cover story hold up under determined questioning? The ancient world was smaller than his own, more intimate. Strangers stood out, and standing out could be fatal. That evening, as they camped in a grove of olive trees that provided some concealment from the road, one of the caravan guards approached Caleb's fire. The man was young, perhaps 20, with the quick movements and alert eyes of a professional soldier. His name was Nicomedes, and he claimed to be from Argos, though Caleb suspected he was actually a deserter from one of the armies. "You're not what you pretend to be," Nicomedes said without preamble, settling down beside the fire. "Oh, you know stonework well enough. I'll grant you that. But you move wrong, you speak wrong, and you ask too many questions about things that don't concern a simple craftsman." Caleb's blood chilled. If a young mercenary could see through his disguise so easily, How long before someone with real authority did the same? I don't know what you mean, he said carefully. Nicomedes laughed, but there was no humour in it. Peace, friend. I'm not looking to cause trouble, but I am curious about what a man like you is really doing on the road to Delphi, because that's where you're really going, isn't it? Not Thebes with the rest of us. There was no point in denying it. Nicomedes had clearly been watching him, listening to his conversations with Lysander. What do you want? Caleb asked. Information, the young man replied. You know things about engineering, about warfare, about lands beyond Greece. That knowledge could be valuable to the right people. I'm thinking we might help each other. What kind of help? Nicomedes leaned closer, lowering his voice. The Spartans took something from Delphi, a sacred disc that the priests want back. Word is they're offering a considerable reward for its return, more than a mercenary like me could earn in 10 years of fighting. Caleb's heart began to race. You know where this disc is. I know where the Spartans who took it are camped, Nicomedes replied. About a day's march from here, guarding a mountain pass. Small force, maybe 24 men. They're confident, maybe too confident. A clever approach might succeed where a direct assault would fail. The implications were staggering. If Nicomedes was telling the truth, then the bronze disc that might hold the key to Caleb's return was within reach. But stealing it would mean infiltrating a Spartan military camp, facing some of the most dangerous warriors in the ancient world. It would mean abandoning his carefully maintained cover as a neutral craftsman and becoming, in effect, a combatant in the war. What would you need from me? Caleb asked. Your knowledge, Nicomedes said simply. Ways to approach the camp undetected, methods of distraction, perhaps some of those engineering tricks you're so good at. In return, we split the reward from the priests. Caleb stared into the fire, watching the flames dance among the olive wood. Every instinct told him this was madness. He was a scholar, not a warrior. His knowledge of ancient military tactics came from books and archaeological evidence, not battlefield experience. The idea of infiltrating a Spartan camp seemed like suicide. But what choice did he have? The bronze disc represented his only concrete lead toward understanding how he had been transported through time. Without it, he might spend the rest of his life trapped in an era where every day brought new dangers, where his very existence was an anomaly that attracted unwanted attention. The thought of growing old and dying in ancient Greece, never seeing his own world again, was more terrifying than any Spartan blade. When would we leave? He asked. Nicomedes smiled, and for the first time it seemed genuine. Tomorrow night. We'll slip away from the caravan after they make camp, circle back through the hills. If we're lucky, we can be in position by the following evening. The next day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Caleb found it difficult to concentrate on the mundane tasks of travel, helping to repair a broken wagon axle, sharing the midday meal with Lysander and the other guards, maintaining the casual conversation that was expected of a travelling craftsman. His mind kept returning to the madness he was about to attempt, the complete departure from everything he understood about his own capabilities. That evening, as the caravan settled into camp beside a small stream, Caleb gathered his few possessions and prepared to leave everything familiar behind once again. Lysander noticed his preparations and approached with obvious concern. "You're not thinking of leaving us, are you?" the trader asked. "The roads are dangerous enough for a caravan. A man alone won't last a day." "I have business that can't wait," Caleb replied, hating the necessity of deceiving someone who had shown him kindness. "Thank you for bringing me this far." Lysander shook his head sadly. "Whatever this business is, it's not worth dying for. Stay with us until Thebes at least. From there you can hire proper guards for whatever fool's errand is driving you." But Caleb had already committed himself to the path ahead. As darkness fell and the caravan settled into sleep, he and Nicomedes slipped away into the night, heading into the mountains where the Spartans waited with their stolen treasure. The terrain was brutal, rocky slopes covered with loose scree that threatened to send them tumbling with every step, dense thickets of thorny brush that tore at their clothes and skin. Nicomedes moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had spent years in the wilderness, while Caleb struggled to keep up, his soft academic life having left him poorly prepared for such physical demands. By dawn they were high in the hills above the main road, looking down at a landscape that seemed to stretch forever. The mountains rolled away toward the horizon in shades of brown and gold. dotted with the dark green of pine forests and the silver gleam of distant streams. It was beautiful and terrible, a reminder of how small and vulnerable they were in this vast untamed world. "There," Nicomedes said, pointing to a narrow valley perhaps a mile away. "See the smoke?" Caleb squinted in the direction indicated and caught sight of thin tendrils rising from what appeared to be a natural amphitheatre carved into the mountainside. "That's them." "Spartan discipline," Nicomedes confirmed. "They're keeping their fires small and clean, trying not to advertise their position, but they're confident enough in their defensive position that they're not bothering with complete concealment. They spent the morning observing the camp from concealment, noting the routines of the guards, the layout of the tents, the location of the horse lines. The Spartans were professional in everything they did. Their sentries changed with clockwork precision. Their patrols followed carefully planned routes that covered all approaches to the valley. These weren't the kind of men who could be surprised by crude tactics or overwhelming force. 23 warriors, Nicomedes counted, plus camp followers and slaves. The treasure will be in the commander's tent, that larger pavilion near the centre of the camp. How do you know they still have the disc? Because they're still here, Nicomedes replied. If they'd delivered it to their superiors, they'd have moved on by now. No, they're waiting for something. Probably orders about where to take their prize. As afternoon faded into evening, Caleb found himself studying the Spartan camp with the analytical mind of an archaeologist. The layout followed principles he recognized from his studies of ancient military sites. Defensive positioning, clear lines of sight, strategic placement of supplies and equipment. But knowing the theory was very different from facing the reality of armed men who would kill without hesitation to protect their mission. The guards change at sunset, Nicomedes observed. There's a brief moment when the day sentries are walking back and the night watch is moving into position. If we time it right, we might be able to slip down the eastern slope and approach from the blind spot near the supply wagons. Caleb's mouth was dry as parchment. And then we improvise, Nicomedes said with a grin that was either supremely confident or completely insane. You said you knew about engineering and distraction methods, time to prove it. As twilight deepened into true darkness, they began their descent toward the Spartan camp. Every step seemed to echo like thunder in Caleb's ears, every displaced stone a potential betrayal of their position. The reality of what they were attempting, 2 men against an entire Spartan unit, struck him as utterly mad. The approach took nearly 2 hours, creeping from shadow to shadow, freezing whenever a sentry's torch passed near their position. By the time they reached the edge of the camp, Caleb's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. The smell of cook fires and horse sweat filled his nostrils, and he could hear the low murmur of conversation from the nearest tents. Nicomedes touched his arm and pointed toward a wagon loaded with supplies. "There," he whispered. "We can use that for cover while we figure out our next move." They crept closer, using the wagon's bulk to shield them from the main body of the camp. From this position, they could see the commander's pavilion clearly, a large tent adorned with Spartan symbols, guarded by 2 warriors who stood like statues in the flickering torchlight. "This is madness," Caleb whispered. "We'll never get past those guards." "We don't need to," Nicomedes replied. "We just need to create a distraction big enough to draw them away. That's where your engineering knowledge comes in." Caleb looked around desperately, trying to apply modern problem-solving techniques to an ancient military situation. The supply wagon held foodstuffs, spare weapons, and his heart leaped. Several clay amphorae that he recognized as fire pots used for siege warfare. Ancient Greek fire was a mixture of pitch, sulfur, and other combustible materials that burned fiercely and was difficult to extinguish. "Can you create a diversion on the far side of the camp?" he asked Nicomedes. "Something that will draw attention away from the commander's tent." "What kind of diversion?" "Leave that to me. Just be ready to move when the guards leave their posts." What followed was perhaps the most terrifying 20 minutes of Caleb's life. Using principles of chemistry that wouldn't be formally understood for centuries, he carefully mixed the contents of several fire pots with materials scavenged from the supply wagon. Ancient warfare had given him an inadvertent education in primitive explosives and incendiaries, knowledge that felt surreal to apply in practice. Meanwhile, Nicomedes crept away through the darkness, moving toward the camp's perimeter where the horses were tethered. The plan was simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. Create simultaneous distractions that would draw the guards away from the commander's tent, allowing one of them to slip inside and locate the bronze disc. The explosions, when they came, were more effective than Caleb had dared hope. The modified firepots detonated in sequence, sending gouts of flame high into the night sky and creating enough noise and chaos to wake the entire camp. Shouts of alarm echoed through the valley as Spartan warriors rushed to respond to what appeared to be a coordinated attack. In the confusion, the guards at the commander's tent abandoned their post to help organise the defence. Caleb seized his chance, sprinting across the open ground and diving through the tent flaps before anyone could spot him. Inside, the pavilion was Spartanly appointed, but clearly the dwelling of a man of authority. Maps and documents were spread across a folding table, and weapons of obvious quality hung from the tent poles. But it was the object resting on a wooden stand near the tent's centre that made Caleb's heart race with recognition. The bronze disc was magnificent, perhaps 18 inches across, inscribed with the same concentric circles he had seen on the sunken altar. The workmanship was exquisite, each line perfectly drawn, each symbol precisely placed. Even in the dim light of the tent's oil lamps it seemed to pulse, with its own inner rhythm, as if the metal itself were alive. He snatched the disc from its stand, surprised by its weight and the warmth of the metal. For a moment he could swear he felt the same vibration that had preceded his transportation through time, a subtle humming that seemed to resonate in his bones. But there was no time to examine it closely. Shouts were growing closer, and he could hear heavy footsteps approaching the tent. Caleb clutched the disc to his chest and prepared to run, but as he reached the tent flaps, a massive figure blocked his path. The Spartan commander stood silhouetted against the flames outside, his bronze armour gleaming in the firelight, his sword already drawn. "I thought as much," the commander said in Greek, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "The fires were a distraction, weren't they? You're after Apollo's disc." There was nowhere to run, no clever stratagem that could save him now. Caleb found himself face to face with one of history's most formidable warriors, holding stolen sacred treasure, with no explanation that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. "You're not Greek," the commander observed, stepping closer. "Your accent, your manner, you're something else entirely. What are you?" Before Caleb could answer, a new voice cut through the night. A woman's voice, speaking in perfect ancient Greek, but with an authority that made even the Spartan commander pause. "He's under the protection of Apollo," the voice declared. "Lower your weapon, Lysander." A figure stepped into the tent's light, and Caleb's breath caught in his throat. She was young, perhaps 25, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command despite her gender. Her dark hair was bound with silver pins, and she wore the simple but elegant robes of a priestess. Most remarkably, she seemed completely unafraid of the armed Spartan warrior who could have killed her with a gesture. "Thaleia," the commander said, and his tone held a mixture of respect and frustration. "This is not your concern. The man is a thief." "The disc belongs to Apollo," she replied firmly. "It was stolen from Delphi, and the god demands its return. This man is merely the instrument of divine will." The commander's eyes narrowed. "You know this man?" "I know what the oracle has revealed," Thaleia said, moving to stand beside Caleb. "There are forces at work here beyond your understanding, Lysander. Forces that even Sparta would be wise not to oppose." For a long moment, the three of them stood in tableau. The Spartan warrior with his drawn sword, the priestess with her quiet authority, and Caleb clutching the bronze disc that had become the centre of an impossible situation. Outside, the sounds of fighting were dying down, as the Spartans gained control of the fires and realised they weren't under actual attack. "You ask me to let him go," the commander said finally, "to abandon my duty for the sake of prophecy and mysticism." "I ask you to consider the consequences of defying the gods," Thaleia replied. "Apollo's wrath is not something to invite lightly." The commander studied Caleb with calculating eyes. "If I let you take the disc, will the attacks on my men cease?" "There will be no more attacks," Caleb said. "You're writing a historical war drama with supernatural elements titled The War Painter. This story blends gritty wartime realism with eerie, dreamlike sequences and explores themes of art as a portal through time, the burden of witnessing history, and the circular nature of fate. The tone should alternate between visceral battlefield authenticity and haunting, otherworldly moments where reality bends around the protagonist's artistic abilities. Julian Cross is your protagonist, a 34-year-old war art restorer working in the present day. He's technically gifted but emotionally guarded, having lost his grandfather, a Normandy veteran, 5 years ago. Julian has spent his career meticulously cleaning and preserving military paintings for museums, finding solace in the precise, methodical work that keeps him disconnected from human relationships. His apartment is sparse, his social life non-existent, and his only companions are the painted soldiers whose faces he restores to their original glory. He carries a worn leather satchel everywhere, filled with restoration tools, brushes, and a battered sketchbook he never uses for personal work. The story opens in Julian's dimly lit restoration studio on a rainy November evening. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting harsh shadows across workbenches cluttered with bottles of solvents, fine brushes and magnifying glasses. The air smells of turpentine and old canvas. Julian works alone on a massive oil painting, 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, depicting the D-Day landing at Omaha Beach. The piece is supposedly painted by an anonymous survivor who created it immediately after the battle, using whatever materials he could scavenge. The painting shows dozens of soldiers struggling through surf and sand under a grey smoke-filled sky. Their faces are rendered with startling intimacy despite the chaos surrounding them. Julian has been working on this restoration for 3 months, and tonight he's focused on removing a stubborn dark smear in the lower right corner that previous restorers couldn't identify. He applies paint thinner with a cotton swab, working in careful circular motions. The smear begins to dissolve, revealing more detailed brushwork beneath, a soldier's hand reaching toward the surf. Julian leans closer, applying more thinner to clear away decades of accumulated grime. Suddenly, his elbow knocks over the bottle of paint thinner. The clear liquid spreads across the canvas, and instead of simply staining the surface, it begins to ripple like water. Julian stumbles backward as the chemical transforms into cold, salt-scented seawater that pours off the canvas and pools on the studio floor. The painted waves seem to move, and Julian hears the distant crash of surf mixed with something else. Shouting, mechanical noise, the whistle of incoming shells. As Julian tries to steady himself, his boots sink into what should be a concrete floor, but now feels like wet sand. The studio walls dissolve into grey morning mist, and he finds himself standing on a beach as chaos erupts around him. Landing craft surge through choppy water, disgorging soldiers into chest-deep surf. Machine gun fire rakes the sand, and mortars explode in towering geysers of water and debris. The air is thick with smoke and the metallic taste of gunpowder. Julian's first instinct is to run, but there's nowhere to go. The beach stretches endlessly in both directions, blocked by concrete obstacles and razor wire. Behind him rise the bluffs of Normandy, scarred with German bunkers that spit muzzle flashes. A soldier staggers past Julian, blood streaming from a head wound, and Julian realizes with growing horror that he's not dreaming. The sand is gritty between his teeth, the explosions make his ears ring, and seawater soaks through his jeans. 3 American soldiers spot Julian and assume he's a civilian spy or saboteur. They drag him behind a disabled tank, shouting questions he can barely hear over the artillery barrage. Julian tries to explain about the painting, about being a restorer, but his words sound insane even to himself. One soldier notices the sketchbook protruding from Julian's satchel and assumes he's a war correspondent who got separated from his unit. Reluctantly, they allow him to stay under guard, warning that if he tries to run, they'll shoot him as a deserter. Throughout the first day and night of the invasion, Julian huddles in foxholes and shell craters, watching the battle unfold with the eye of someone who has studied countless military paintings. He recognizes tactical movements, the way light falls on smoke, the particular exhaustion that settles over men's faces after hours of combat. But this isn't paint on canvas. It's visceral, immediate, and terrifying in ways no artwork could capture. During a brief lull in the fighting, Julian hears a voice that seems to speak directly inside his head, whispering about tides and blood, about finishing what was started, about paint mixed with seawater under a grey sky. The voice tells him he must recreate the battle scene using pigments mixed with actual ocean water from Omaha Beach. Only then can he return to his own time. Julian initially dismisses this as trauma-induced hallucination, but as hours pass, the whispers become more insistent and specific. Julian realizes he needs to reach the surf line to collect the enchanted seawater, but every attempt is driven back by German machine gun fire. The beach has become a killing ground where hundreds of bodies wash back and forth with each wave. Julian watches soldiers he recognises from the original painting, their faces etched in his memory from months of restoration work. But here they're alive, sharing cigarettes, telling jokes, showing photographs of sweethearts back home. One soldier, Private Sam Weller, takes Julian under his wing. Sam is 19, from Ohio, with dreams of attending art school after the war. He carries a small sketchbook filled with drawings of fellow soldiers, landscapes and detailed studies of military equipment. Sam and Julian bond over their shared artistic interests, and Julian finds himself caring about this young man's survival, despite knowing the original painting showed no soldier matching Sam's description. As Julian begins sketching scenes from the battle by lamplight in their foxhole, he makes a disturbing discovery. When he draws a soldier's face before that man dies, the figure vanishes from Julian's mental image of the original painting. The scene in his head, memorised from months of restoration, begins to shift and change with each sketch he creates. He realises his presence in 1944 is altering history in subtle but potentially catastrophic ways. Julian learns from a wounded French civilian that the original painter of the D-Day piece vanished mysteriously shortly after the war ended. Local villagers reported seeing a man matching the artist's description on the beach months later, standing in the surf at dawn, holding a paintbrush that dripped seawater instead of paint. The civilian warns Julian in broken English that some canvases are doorways that swing both ways, trapping those who pass through them in endless cycles. The battle continues for 3 days, and Julian watches helplessly as soldiers he has grown to care about are killed or wounded. Each death feels personal now. These aren't anonymous figures from history, but individuals with hopes, fears, and stories. Sam shows Julian letters from his girlfriend, shares his rations, and talks about the art gallery he plans to open in Cleveland. Julian finds himself desperately wanting to warn Sam about dangers he sees coming, but every attempt to change events creates new ripples in the timeline. On the morning of June 9th, Julian can no longer ignore the voices in his head or the way his sketches are rewriting history. He makes a desperate decision to reach the waterline no matter the cost. As dawn breaks grey and cold over the beach, Julian sprints across the sand toward the surf, clutching his sketchbook and a makeshift brush carved from a piece of driftwood. Bullets whine past his head and kick up sand around his feet. Mortar shells explode close enough to shower him with debris. Julian reaches the water's edge as German machine guns zero in on his position. He scoops ocean water into his canteen, mixing it with pigments he has scavenged from destroyed supply crates, red from medical supplies, black from burned wood, blue from torn uniforms, white from scattered lime. He begins painting frantically on a piece of canvas torn from a damaged landing craft, every brushstroke matching what he remembers from the original work in his studio. As Julian paints, Private Sam Weller provides covering fire from a nearby shell crater. German bullets find their mark, and Sam takes a fatal hit in the chest. As he dies, Sam presses a spent bullet casing into Julian's paint-stained hand, gasping, "You'll finish it, won't you?" Someone has to finish it. Julian dips the bullet casing in seawater and uses it like a brush to paint the final soldier into place, a figure reaching toward the surf with desperate outstretched fingers. The moment Julian completes the last brushstroke, the roar of battle begins to fade. The painting in his hands starts to glow with a faint phosphorescent light, as if lit from within by moonlight on water. A wave rises impossibly high from the channel, towering over the beach like a moving wall. As it crashes over Julian, he feels himself pulled down into cold, dark water that tastes of salt and thyme and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Julian gasps awake in his restoration studio, soaking wet and shivering. The massive D-Day painting stands before him, fully restored and perfect. Every detail matches his memory, but now he recognises faces, soldiers he spoke with, shared meals with, watched die. In the lower right corner where he had been working to remove that stubborn smear, he now sees Private Sam Weller's face clearly rendered, looking out from among the crowd of soldiers with eyes that seem to follow Julian around the room. Julian notices something else that makes his blood run cold. In the bottom corner of the painting, barely visible unless you know where to look, is a small signature in paint that still appears wet. J. Cross, June 1944. His own signature, painted with seawater and blood and the desperate hope of a dying soldier. Julian closes the studio for the night, but as he walks down the empty street toward his apartment, he hears the faint sound of waves lapping against sand and the distant echo of artillery fire. In his pocket, his fingers close around a spent bullet casing that shouldn't exist, still warm to the touch and smelling of gunpowder and the sea. Write this story with attention to sensory details, the smell of turpentine and blood, the taste of salt spray and fear, the feel of wet sand and cold metal. Balance the supernatural elements with historical authenticity, researching actual details of the D-Day invasion to ground the fantastical elements in reality. Develop Julian's character arc from isolated observer to reluctant participant to someone who understands the weight of bearing witness to history. Show his growing connection to the soldiers, particularly Sam, and the moral complexity of his situation. Knowing he can't save them without potentially unravelling history itself, the dialogue should feel authentic to both time periods, with Julian's modern speech patterns contrasting with the World War II era soldiers. Build tension through the gradual revelation that Julian is trapped in a time loop destined to become the mysterious artist whose work he was restoring. Use the painting itself as both a literal object and a metaphor for how art preserves memory and connects us across time. Pay particular attention to the battle sequences, making them visceral and immediate without glorifying violence. Show the chaos, terror and humanity of war through Julian's eyes as both an artist and an unwilling participant. The supernatural elements should feel organic to the story, growing naturally from Julian's connection to the artwork rather than feeling imposed from outside. The ending should be ambiguous. Is Julian truly back in his own time or trapped in an endless cycle? The sound of waves and gunfire following him suggests the experience has changed him permanently, marking him as someone who exists between worlds, between observer and participant, between past and present. His discovery of his own signature on the painting confirms that he has become part of the very history he was studying, completing a circle that perhaps has no beginning or end. Explore the psychological transformation Julian undergoes throughout this experience. Initially, he approaches war art as an academic exercise, a technical challenge requiring steady hands and historical knowledge but no emotional investment. His grandfather's war stories were just family history, distant and sanitized by time. The restored paintings in his studio are artifacts, not windows into human suffering. Julian's emotional walls, built after his grandfather's death, have made him an expert at observing without feeling, at preserving the past without connecting to it. When Julian first arrives on Omaha Beach, he experiences sensory overload that should be described in overwhelming detail. The cacophony isn't just loud, it's an assault on every sense. The smell isn't just gunpowder, but the acrid tang of cordite mixed with salt spray, blood, vomit, and the metallic scent of fear sweat. The sand isn't just wet, it's cold and gritty, working its way into his shoes, his clothes, his mouth. The water isn't just seawater, it's tinged pink with blood and thick with debris, oil slicks, and the personal belongings of dead soldiers. Develop Julian's artistic eye as both a blessing and a curse in this environment. His trained ability to notice composition, lighting and colour serves him well in observing tactical situations and predicting enemy movements. He notices how the grey morning light creates natural camouflage, how the angle of incoming shells reveals hidden artillery positions, how the body language of experienced soldiers differs from that of terrified replacements. But this same artistic sensitivity makes him acutely aware of details others might miss or ignore, the way blood spreads in seawater, the particular blue-grey colour of hypothermic skin, the geometric patterns that shrapnel carves in sand and flesh. Julian's sketchbook becomes a crucial character in its own right. Initially, he draws purely from habit and nervous energy, his hands needing something to do while his mind processes the impossible situation. But as he begins to understand the supernatural rules governing his presence in 1944, the sketchbook transforms into both a tool and a prison. Each drawing he creates alters the timeline in ways he can't fully predict or control. A quick sketch of a landing craft changes its arrival time by minutes. A portrait of a soldier prevents that man's death but causes 3 others. Julian realises he's not just witnessing history, he's rewriting it with every line he draws. Private Sam Weller should be developed as more than just a sympathetic victim. Make him Julian's foil and mirror, a young man with artistic dreams who approaches war with optimism and humanity that Julian lost years ago. Sam carries letters from his girlfriend Mary, who works in an aircraft factory in Ohio. He shows Julian her photograph, talks about their plans to marry after the war, describes the house they'll buy and the children they'll have. Sam's artwork is raw but enthusiastic. He draws portraits of his fellow soldiers to send home to their families, sketches of French countryside for his girlfriend, technical drawings of German equipment that he finds beautiful despite their deadly purpose. Through Sam, Julian remembers what it feels like to believe in the future, to see beauty even in ugly circumstances, to maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that hope is foolish. Sam's death becomes not just a plot point but a devastating personal loss that forces Julian to confront his own emotional numbness. When Sam presses that bullet casing into Julian's hand, he's not just asking Julian to finish the painting, he's asking him to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that their sacrifice means something. The supernatural elements should be grounded in art history and folklore. Research real stories of paintings that seem to move or change, of artists who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, of artworks that appear to have been painted by people who couldn't have been present at the depicted events. The voice in Julian's head that whispers about blood and tide should sound like it comes from multiple sources. The original anonymous artist, other time-displaced painters, perhaps even the canvas itself as a repository of traumatic memory. Develop the concept that some artworks serve as temporal anchors, created at moments of such intense human emotion that they puncture holes in time itself. The D-Day painting isn't unique. Throughout history, artists have found themselves trapped in their own works, doomed to repeat the same scenes over and over until someone else stumbles through the canvas to take their place. Julian begins to understand that his grandfather's war stories weren't just memories, but warnings, clues left behind by a man who suspected his grandson might one day face the same choice between observation and participation. The restoration studio should be described as a liminal space even before the supernatural events begin. It exists between day and night, between past and present, between preservation and decay. Julian works alone in a basement room lined with paintings from every major conflict of the past 2 centuries. Revolutionary War portraits hang next to Civil War battle scenes. World War I landscapes neighbour Vietnam photographs. The air is thick with the accumulated weight of human suffering and sacrifice, preserved in pigment and varnish. When Julian returns to this space after his experience at Normandy, it should feel fundamentally different. The paintings seem to watch him with knowing eyes. He hears whispers from other canvases, glimpses movement in his peripheral vision, feels the pull of other temporal doorways. His work becomes tormented as he realizes every painting he restores might be another trap, another opportunity for the past to claim him. Detail the technical aspects of Julian's painting process on Omaha Beach to emphasize both his artistic training and the desperate improvisation required by his circumstances. He must create pigments from whatever materials he can scavenge. Red from blood and rust, black from charcoal and gunpowder residue, brown from mud and sand, white from chalk and crushed bone. His brushes are fashioned from splinters of wood, wrapped with threads pulled from torn uniforms. The canvas itself is a fragment torn from a destroyed supply tent, rough and poorly primed but the only available surface. Julian's painting technique under fire should reflect both his professional training and his emotional state. His usual precise, methodical approach gives way to broad, urgent strokes driven by fear and desperation. Yet his artistic eye remains sharp. He captures not just the visual facts of the scene, but its emotional truth, the way terror and heroism exist simultaneously in the same moment, the way death and life interweave on the beach like colours bleeding together on wet canvas. Expand the time Julian spends with the soldiers to develop multiple relationships beyond just Sam Weller. Create a small squad of characters who each represent different aspects of the human experience of war. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a career soldier from Texas who has fought in North Africa and Italy, serves as a father figure to the younger men and shares Julian's artistic eye, though he expresses it through tactical awareness rather than drawing. Corporal Danny O'Brien, an Irish kid from Boston, copes with fear through constant jokes and storytelling, reminding Julian of his grandfather's generation. Private First Class Robert Washington, an African-American soldier from Alabama, carries himself with quiet dignity despite facing both enemy fire and his own army's segregation, teaching Julian about different forms of courage. Each of these men should have specific details that Julian observes with his artist's eye. The way Torres unconsciously sketches tactical diagrams in the sand while thinking, how O'Brien's hands shake except when he's telling a story, the way Washington's eyes constantly scan for threats that might come from his own side as well as the enemy. When these men die, or are wounded, Julian feels each loss personally, understanding that he's not just witnessing history, but participating in the destruction of individual worlds, each containing irreplaceable stories and unfulfilled dreams. The French civilian who warns Julian about the painting's history should be developed as more than just an exposition device. Make him an elderly man named Marcel Dubois, a former art dealer who fled Paris when the Germans arrived. Marcel has been trapped in the coastal village throughout the occupation, watching German soldiers turn his home into a fortress. He recognises something familiar in Julian's eyes, the look of someone who has seen too much, who carries knowledge that doesn't belong to his time. Marcel's warning about canvases that swing both ways comes from personal experience. His own father disappeared into a painting of the Franco-Prussian War, leaving behind only a palette knife stuck in wet paint that never dried. Develop the idea that Julian's presence in 1944 creates a temporal paradox that becomes increasingly dangerous the longer he remains. His sketches don't just change individual fates, they begin to alter the entire course of the invasion. A German machine gun position that should have been destroyed remains active because Julian sketched the gunner's face, creating a sympathetic connection that prevented an Allied grenade from finding its mark. A landing craft that should have made it safely to shore founders, because Julian drew attention to a structural weakness that then manifested in reality. Julian realises that his very act of witnessing is changing what he witnesses, creating a feedback loop that could unravel the Allied victory entirely. This understanding adds moral complexity to his situation. He must choose between saving individual soldiers he has come to care about and preserving the larger historical outcome that he knows must occur. The weight of this responsibility, of being forced to allow good men to die for the greater good, breaks something fundamental in Julian's carefully constructed emotional defences. The ending should include subtle hints that Julian's experience has left him fundamentally changed in ways that extend beyond psychological trauma. He notices that his hands now shake slightly when holding modern brushes, as if they remember the weight of makeshift tools crafted from battlefield debris. Colours seem different to his eyes. He sees undertones of red in everything, hears the whisper of distant artillery and the hiss of his studio's ventilation system. When he looks at other military paintings, he sometimes glimpses movement in his peripheral vision, as if the canvas subjects are turning to acknowledge his presence. Most importantly, Julian discovers that his ability to step through paintings isn't limited to the D-Day piece. Other canvases in his studio begin to call to him. A Revolutionary War scene painted by an unknown artist, a Civil War battlefield rendered in oils that still smell of gunpowder, a Vietnam jungle that seems to move with its own wind. Julian realises he has become something between human and artwork himself, a living bridge between past and present who can no longer exist fully in either time. The story should end with Julian making a conscious choice about his future. He could abandon art restoration entirely, fleeing from the supernatural burden he now carries. He could embrace his new role as a guardian of temporal boundaries, ensuring that other artists don't become trapped as he was. Or he could accept his fate as someone destined to move between times, serving as witness and participant in humanity's greatest and most terrible moments. The ambiguity lies not in what happens to Julian, but in what he chooses to do with his transformation. The final image should be Julian walking through the city at night, the sounds of waves and gunfire following him like a supernatural soundtrack. But now these sounds don't torment him. They remind him of his connection to something larger than himself, his responsibility to the dead who trusted him with their stories. In his pocket, Sam Weller's bullet casing serves as both talisman and reminder that some sacrifices create obligations that transcend time itself. Julian has become the keeper of painted memories, the guardian of canvas doorways, the artist who must finish what others started regardless of the personal cost. This story should ultimately ask whether it's possible to witness history without becoming part of it, whether art can preserve truth without transforming it, and whether some responsibilities are so profound they echo across time itself. Julian's journey from isolated observer to reluctant participant to conscious guardian represents not just a supernatural adventure, but a meditation on the relationship between past and present, between individual choice and historical necessity, between the artist's duty to record and the human obligation to care. The salt spray hit Elias Ward's face as he surfaced, the regulator sliding from between his teeth with a satisfying pop. 30 feet below, the skeletal remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge lay scattered across the ocean floor like the bones of some ancient beast, each timber and cannonball a testament to the violence that had claimed her. He'd been diving these waters off Ocracoke for 3 weeks now, part of a joint expedition between the University of North Carolina and the Maritime Archaeology Division, each descent revealing new secrets from Blackbeard's legendary flagship. The wreck fascinated him in ways that went beyond professional interest. While other archaeologists focused on pottery shards and ship construction techniques, Elias found himself drawn to the personal artefacts, the things that had belonged to real men who'd lived and died in these waters 3 centuries ago. A pewter spoon, worn smooth by countless meals, a bone-handled knife with initials carved into its grip. These fragments spoke to him of individual stories, of lives cut short by cannon and cutlass in the golden age of piracy. "Find anything good down there, Ward?" called Dr. Sarah Chen from the recovery vessel's stern. She was hauling in the dive line, her movements efficient despite the rolling deck. Elias kicked toward the boat's ladder, his mesh bag heavy with artifacts. Maybe. Got some pewter pieces, what looks like part of a cutlass guard, and some ship's buttons. He paused, treading water, suddenly remembering the weight in his wetsuit's utility pocket. And this. He held up the compass, its brass case green with verdigris and pitted with centuries of corrosion. The glass face was spiderwebbed with hairline cracks that seemed to map out invisible coastlines. But it was the dark stains filling those fissures that caught the light strangely. Stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood, too dark and organic to be mere rust. "Christ, that thing's seen better days," Sarah muttered, helping him up the ladder with practiced efficiency. Her hands were steady despite the boat's gentle roll, a testament to years spent on research vessels in waters far rougher than these. Probably not even Blackbeard's era. Could be from any wreck in these waters. Hell, could have washed down from a modern yacht for all we know. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. As he toweled off on the sun-warmed deck, the compass seemed to grow warm in his palm, its broken needle trembling despite the still air and calm seas. The sensation reminded him of holding a bird's heart. Rapid, fragile, alive. When he'd first spotted it wedged between 2 cannonballs on the ocean floor, partially buried in centuries of sediment, something had compelled him to reach for it immediately, ignoring the other artifacts scattered nearby. It was the kind of reaction that would have earned him a lecture from his professors about proper excavation protocol, about the importance of photographing items in situ before removal. But down there, in the blue-green twilight of 30 feet of Atlantic water, academic protocol had seemed less important than the urgent need to claim this particular piece of the past. The rest of the crew had gone below for dinner and cards, leaving him alone on deck as sunset painted the sky the colour of spilled wine. The western horizon blazed with reds and purples that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, but something about the light made Elias uneasy. It reminded him too much of blood in water, spreading and diluting until the entire world seemed stained. Elias turned the compass over in his hands, noting details that hadn't been visible underwater. The brass showed evidence of master craftsmanship, intricate engravings that spoke of wealth and importance. Around the edge, barely legible through the corrosion, ran a faint inscription in what looked like Latin. "By blood bound, by blood freed." The words sent an inexplicable chill down his spine, raising goosebumps along his arms despite the warm evening air. He'd always been drawn to pirate history, particularly Blackbeard's story. It had started in childhood with romantic notions of treasure maps and daring adventures, but his academic training had revealed the darker truth. Edward Teach, or Thatch, depending on which historical source you trusted, had ruled these waters like a demon king, using calculated brutality and psychological warfare to build his reputation. Most of his victims surrendered without a fight, terrified by stories of his cruelty, until Lieutenant Robert Maynard ended his reign in November 1718, right here in these very waters. Elias had read every account of that final battle, studied every map, analysed every witness statement until he knew the story better than most professional historians. The scholarly articles were dry and clinical, but between the lines, he could sense the terror and chaos of that November morning when two worlds, the age of piracy and the age of naval authority, collided in blood and gunpowder smoke. Maybe that's why he felt so empty inside, surrounded by all this history but unable to touch it, to truly understand what it had been like to live in that violent, lawless world. His brother Danny had always teased him about living in the past, said he needed to focus on the present, find a girlfriend, build a real life instead of hiding in dusty archives and underwater graveyards. But Danny was gone now, had been for 5 years, pulled under by a riptide while Elias watched helplessly from shore, too far away to help, too slow to save the only person who'd ever really understood him. The present was just guilt and loneliness and the constant weight of what-ifs. The past, at least, felt safe. Its tragedies were already written, its endings already known. He tapped the compass's cracked glass with his fingernail, hoping to see if the needle would respond. The metal felt almost feverish against his skin now, uncomfortably warm in the cooling evening air. Instead of the gentle tremor he'd expected, the needle began to spin, slowly at first, like a compass seeking magnetic north, then faster, faster, until it became a copper blur. The stains in the cracks seemed to darken and spread, like fresh blood seeping through broken skin. The deck lurched beneath his feet. Though the sea had been glass-calm moments before, Elias stumbled, clutching the compass as vertigo overwhelmed him, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The horizon tilted crazily, up, becoming down, and suddenly the peaceful evening transformed into a maelstrom. Water rose in towering walls around the boat, forming a perfect cylinder with Elias at its centre, the ocean itself seeming to reach up and claim him. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the compass's needle, finally still, pointing towards something beyond the edge of the world. Cold. Salt. The burn of seawater in his lungs as he fought his way to the surface. Elias broke through, gasping and choking, the compass still clutched in his death grip, its edges cutting into his palm. But the recovery vessel was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. In its place, wooden ships battled through clouds of cannon smoke that turned the morning air into a choking grey haze, their sails torn and bloody, their hulls splintered by point-blank cannon fire. The sound hit him like a physical assault, the thunderous roar of naval artillery, the crack of muskets, the screams of dying men carrying across the water. This wasn't the sanitised version of naval combat he'd read about in history books. This was chaos incarnate, a symphony of violence that filled his nostrils with the stench of gunpowder and blood. There, a survivor in the water. The voice carried an accent Elias had only heard approximated in period films, thick, rolling, unmistakably 18th century. Strong hands hauled him from the churning sea onto a deck slick with gore and splintered wood. The planks beneath his feet were stained dark with blood that was still warm, still wet, and his stomach lurched as he realised some of it was seeping into his modern diving boots. Pirates. Actual honest-to-God pirates surrounded him, and they looked nothing like the romanticised figures of popular culture. Their faces were streaked with powder burns and salt, weathered by years of sun and wind and violence. They wore no theatrical costumes, just practical wool and canvas, stained with blood and sea spray and the grime of hard living. Many bore the scars of previous battles, missing fingers, white lines across faces, the telltale puckered marks of old gunshot wounds. The smell hit him like a physical blow, unwashed bodies that reeked of sweat and tar, gunpowder that filled his sinuses with its acrid bite, and underneath it all the copper tang of fresh blood and the sweet, sick smell of death. One man near him was pressing a torn piece of sailcloth against a gaping wound in his shoulder, his face grey with blood loss but his eyes still burning with battle fever. "What ship you from, boy?" demanded a scarred man with gold teeth, several of them missing entirely. A cutlass hung from his belt, its blade notched from use, and his hands were stained with what Elias hoped was gunpowder residue. "You don't look like Navy, but you sure as hell ain't one of ours." Elias tried to speak, but only seawater came up, burning his throat as he retched onto the bloody deck. The compass in his hand pulsed with warmth, almost burning against his palm, and he could swear he felt it pulling him in a specific direction, like a lodestone seeking iron. Around him the battle raged on with medieval brutality, cannon fire that shook the ship's timbers, screaming that sounded barely human, and the wet final sounds of metal meeting flesh. "Bring him below," growled another voice, this one carrying absolute authority. "We'll sort him proper after we've sent these navy dogs to Davy Jones." They dragged him to a cramped space below deck that reeked of bilge water, human waste, and the sour smell of men living too close together for too long. The improvised cell was little more than a storage compartment pressed into service as a brig, its walls formed by water barrels lashed together with rope. Through the gaps in the planking above, Elias could hear the battle continuing, shouts of "Board them, you scurvy dog, yam, and give 'em no quarter," mixed with the wet sounds of hand-to-hand combat and the screams of the dying. The compass grew warmer with each passing moment, as if feeding on the violence above. In the dim light filtering through the deck planks, Elias could see that the dark stains in its cracked glass were definitely moving now, spreading like ink in water, and the needle had begun to glow with a faint phosphorescent light that reminded him uncomfortably of foxfire in a graveyard. Hours passed before the sounds of battle finally faded, replaced by the ordinary shipboard noises of men working, the creak of rigging, the splash of water being used to swab blood from the deck, the low conversations of survivors taking inventory of their wounds and their losses. Elias huddled in the darkness, trying to process what had happened to him. Time travel was impossible, had to be. But the evidence surrounded him, the authentic ship construction with its hand-hewn timbers and iron nails, the smells that no historical recreation could replicate, the accents that spoke of a different century entirely, and most convincing of all, the casual brutality he'd witnessed, the kind that belonged to an age when human life was cheaper than gunpowder. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the jingle of metal. Pistols, Elias realised, multiple pistols carried by someone who expected to use them. The makeshift cell door swung open with a groan of protest from its leather hinges. The man who entered had to duck his massive frame to fit through the opening, and even in the dim light, Elias recognised him instantly from countless historical descriptions and artistic interpretations. The wild black beard, woven through with slow match that would burn during battle to surround his face with smoke and flame. The multiple pistols crossed over his chest like some deadly bandolier, each one lovingly maintained and ready for use. Arms the size of ship's timbers, scarred from decades of swordwork and marked with tattoos that told stories of ports visited and battles won. And those eyes, intelligent and calculating, but burning with a kind of madness that came from absolute power over life and death. Edward Teach, Blackbeard himself in the flesh, larger and more terrifying than any historical account had managed to convey. "So," the pirate rumbled, settling his bulk onto a crate across from Elias with surprising grace. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience, but there was curiosity there too, and something else. A wariness that spoke of survival instincts honed by years of staying one step ahead of the hangman's noose. "You've caused quite a stir among my boys, lad. They found you floating where no man should survive, clutching that trinket like it were made of the finest Spanish gold." He nodded at the compass. "Some say ye appeared from nowhere, right in the thick of the fighting." Elias found his voice at last. "Where am I?" "Aboard the Adventure, off the coast of Carolina. November 22nd, in the year of our Lord 1718. Blackbeard's eyes glittered with dark amusement. "Though I suspect you knew that already. Question is, how did ye come to be here, and why does that compass of yours fair glow when I draw near?" The date hit Elias like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and making his vision swim. November 22nd, 1718. The day of Blackbeard's death, recorded in history with brutal precision. Lieutenant Maynard would ambush the pirate at dawn, and by morning's end Blackbeard's severed head would hang from Maynard's bowsprit as proof that the age of piracy was ending. This man sitting before him, radiating power and menace, had perhaps 12 hours left to live. The compass in Elias's pocket pulsed with renewed heat, as if responding to the proximity of its destined target. For a wild moment Elias considered warning him, telling Blackbeard what history had recorded. But what would be the point? Even if the pirate believed him, which was unlikely, changing history might have consequences beyond imagining. And besides, Elias suspected with growing certainty that he wasn't here to change anything. He was here to complete something, to fulfill some cosmic purpose that the compass had been waiting centuries to achieve. Elias began, then stopped. How could he explain? That he was from the future? That he knew how this story ended? I don't remember. I was on a ship, and then I was in the water. Blackbeard studied him for a long moment. You speak strangely, boy. Not like any colonial I've known, nor any Englishman either. And those clothes... He gestured at Elias's modern wetsuit, still damp with seawater. Never seen their like. The compass pulsed again, stronger this time. Blackbeard's eyes fixed on it immediately. May I? He asked, extending a massive scarred hand. Every instinct screamed at Elias to refuse, but something in the pirate's tone, curiosity rather than demand, made him comply. The moment Blackbeard's fingers closed around the compass, it flared with heat so intense that both men jerked back. Christ's blood, Blackbeard muttered, staring at the artifact with new respect. That's no ordinary compass. Where did you come by it? I found it, Elias said truthfully. On your ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. The pirate's eyebrows rose. My flagship's been aground for months, lad. No man could retrieve anything from her now. Not now, Elias said quietly. Later. They stared at each other in the flickering lamplight. Finally, Blackbeard leaned back, a slow smile spreading beneath his infamous beard. You're either mad as a March hare, or you're something far stranger than any man I've met in 20 years at sea. He stood, his head nearly touching the deck beams. Either way, you'll stay aboard. I've a feeling you might prove useful. The next hours blurred together in a haze of organised chaos that spoke of men who had lived their entire lives balanced on the knife's edge between victory and death. Pirates swarmed over the ship like ants, but their movements were purposeful, efficient. They swabbed the deck clean of blood, repaired damaged rigging with the skill of professional seamen, and tended to their wounded with a rough competence born of necessity. Elias found himself pressed into service when one of the crew noticed his modern knowledge of sailing principles. His explanation of wind dynamics, translated into 18th century terms, earned grudging respect from men who had learned their seamanship through trial and error. They set him to work splicing rope, a task that required more skill than he possessed, but which kept him busy while the compass burned like a coal against his chest, where he'd hidden it beneath his torn wetsuit. As the night wore on, he learned the crew's names and their stories through overheard conversations and direct questioning. There was Israel Hands, Blackbeard's trusted lieutenant, nursing a wounded leg from an earlier skirmish. Black Caesar, a former slave who had earned his freedom through skill with both cutlass and cannon. Philip Morton, barely 16, who had joined the crew after his merchant ship had been taken, choosing piracy over death and finding he had a taste for the life. These weren't the romanticised pirates of legend. They were hard men who had chosen a hard life, knowing it would likely be short. They fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose, and they were fiercely loyal to the man who had given them purpose and profit in a world that offered them neither. All the while, the compass grew hotter, its heat sometimes so intense that Elias had to shift position to keep it from burning his skin. The needle, when he checked it during brief moments of privacy, spun wildly before locking onto Blackbeard's position with unerring accuracy, no matter where the captain moved about the ship. As dawn approached with inevitable finality, painting the eastern sky the colour of old blood, Elias positioned himself near the ship's starboard rail. The compass had grown almost too hot to touch, its brass case now radiating heat like a coal fresh from the forge. Its needle spun wildly for several moments before freezing in place with mechanical precision, pointing toward the eastern horizon where history waited to unfold. There, emerging from the morning mist like vengeful ghosts, came Lieutenant Maynard's ships. The HMS Pearl and HMS Lime appeared first as shadows, then as solid reality. Their gunports open like hungry mouths, their decks crowded with Royal Navy Marines whose red coats seemed to glow in the early light. Elias could see the British ensign snapping in the morning breeze, and beneath it smaller pennants that marked this as no ordinary patrol. This was a hunting expedition, and Blackbeard was the prize they had come to claim. "All hands on deck," Blackbeard's voice carried across the water like thunder, cutting through the morning stillness with absolute authority. Today we send King George's lapdogs to hell where they belong. Show them how free men die. The crew responded with a roar that seemed to shake the very timbers of the ship. These were men who had lived outside the law for so long that death held no terror for them. Only the manner of dying mattered, and they were determined to make it cost their enemies dearly. The battle erupted with savage intensity that made the previous day's fighting seem like a gentleman's disagreement. Cannons roared with earth-shaking violence, filling the air with acrid smoke and screaming metal fragments. The smell of gunpowder became so thick it was hard to breathe, and the crash of round shot against timber echoed like thunder in a confined space. Elias watched it all through a haze of disbelief and terror, clutching the compass so tightly its edges cut into his palm. He spotted Blackbeard in the thick of the fighting, moving through the melee like some primordial force of nature. The pirate's coattails streamed behind him as he parried and thrust, his multiple pistols barking death at point-blank range. But even from a distance, Elias could see the wounds beginning to take their toll, dark stains spreading across the pirate's shirt, his movements growing slightly more laboured. The compass began to vibrate, its heat now nearly unbearable. Elias looked down and gasped. The dried blood in the cracks was liquefying, running fresh as if newly spilled. The needle spun once, twice, then locked onto Blackbeard's position with absolute certainty. A cutlass whistled past Elias's ear with a sound like tearing silk, wielded by a navy midshipman no older than 16, whose face was streaked with powder burns and tears of terror. The boy was fighting with the desperate ferocity of someone who knew he was likely to die in the next few minutes, his movements wild and untrained but driven by pure survival instinct. Without thinking, Elias tackled the youth, sending them both crashing to the deck in a tangle of limbs. The compass flew from his hand, skittering across the blood-slicked planks toward the main fighting like a thing alive, leaving a trail of phosphorescent light in its wake. Its glow was clearly visible now, pulsing in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the violence surrounding them. No! Elias scrambled after it, pushing through the press of fighting bodies with desperate urgency. A pistol ball whined overhead, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage, and something wet splattered across his face. Blood from a wounded pirate who staggered past, clutching a gaping sword wound in his side. The compass lay just beyond his reach, pulsing with otherworldly light that seemed to cast no shadows despite its intensity. As his fingers closed around it, visions flashed through his mind, fragments of the compass's history, glimpses of the men who had carried it through decades of violence and adventure. He saw it being crafted in a Spanish colonial forge, blessed with blood and salt by a quartermaster who understood the old ways, the ancient compacts between men and the sea. He saw it guiding ships through impossible storms, pointing not toward magnetic north but toward destiny itself. That's when he saw him, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, advancing on Blackbeard with deadly purpose, his face a mask of grim determination. The British officer was younger than Elias had expected, perhaps 30 years old, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a professional killer. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his sword notched from recent use, and he moved with the controlled aggression of a man who had been trained to kill and had learned to enjoy it. The pirate captain was wounded, bleeding from multiple cuts that would have felled a lesser man, but his eyes still burned with the unholy fire that had made him legend. Steel rang against steel in a deadly dance as the two men circled each other like predators, each seeking the opening that would end the other's life. Maynard was skilled, trained in European swordsmanship, but Blackbeard fought with the brutal pragmatism of a man who had learned his craft in a dozen different ports, where hesitation meant death. Around them, the battle was winding down to its inevitable conclusion. The pirates, outnumbered and outgunned, were falling one by one. Some died fighting, others tried to surrender only to be cut down by marines drunk on blood and victory. The deck was slippery with gore, and the morning air rang with the groans of the dying and the triumphant shouts of the victors. Elias lunged for the compass just as Maynard's blade found its mark, sliding between Blackbeard's ribs with surgical precision. The sound was indescribable, wet and final, like the closing of a door that would never open again, the ending of an entire era written in steel and blood. Blackbeard staggered but didn't fall. One massive hand pressed to the wound, dark arterial blood seeping between his fingers and spattering the deck with drops that steamed in the cool morning air. But Maynard wasn't finished. With cold efficiency, he drew his second blade and slashed it across Blackbeard's throat, opening the great vessels there in a spray of crimson that painted the rigging like some macabre artwork. This was the wound that history recorded, the killing stroke that would end the age of piracy and make Maynard's reputation. Time seemed to slow as Elias reached the pirate's side, his modern sneakers slipping in the spreading pool of blood. Blackbeard's eyes found his, and in them Elias saw not just recognition but understanding, not of his face, but of something deeper, some cosmic purpose that connected them across the centuries like invisible chains. "I know ye," Blackbeard whispered, his voice a wet rasp that bubbled with the blood filling his lungs. "Seen ye in my dreams, boy, always standing at the edge of things, watching, waiting." His hand reached out, fingers stained with his own mortality. "Ye came to see me die, didn't ye? To witness the ending of it all?" With trembling hands, Elias pressed the compass into Blackbeard's palm, feeling the pirate's life ebbing away beneath his fingers like sand through an hourglass. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into sensation. Images flashed through his mind with the violence of lightning. The compass being forged in a candlelit Caribbean smithy, blessed with blood and salt water by a quartermaster who understood the old ways, the ancient compacts between men and the forces that ruled the deep. He saw its decades of faithful service, guiding desperate men through treacherous waters and impossible storms, always pointing toward their heart's desire rather than mere magnetic north. And he saw its final purpose, to serve as a bridge between what was and what would be, to allow the past to reach out and touch the future, to ensure that some stories would never truly end. Blackbeard's fingers closed around the artifact with the last of his strength, and his blood, still warm, still carrying the essence of a life lived without compromise, seeped into its ancient cracks like water into thirsty earth. The needle, which had spun wild and desperate for so long, finally found its true destination and stopped with mechanical finality. "By blood bound," the dying pirate whispered, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "By blood freed," his eyes fixed on something beyond Elias, beyond the ship, perhaps beyond the world itself. Tell them we were here. Tell them we lived free." The compass flared with brilliant light that seemed to come from within the very metal itself, a radiance that painted everything around them in stark black and white contrasts. Suddenly the battle, the ship, even time itself seemed to collapse inward like a dying star, reality folding in on itself until there was nothing but the compass, the dying pirate, and the eternal moment between heartbeats. Water rose around Elias. Not the warm, blood-tinged seawater of 1718, but something cleaner, colder, carrying with it the taste of the modern world. He felt himself falling upward through liquid darkness, the sounds of the 18th century fading like echoes in a vast cathedral, replaced gradually by the familiar hum of boat engines and the distant cry of seagulls. He surfaced with a gasp that tore his throat raw, his lungs burning as if he'd been underwater for hours instead of moments. The recovery vessel's familiar deck materialized beneath his hands, solid and reassuring after the shifting reality of the past. Dr. Chen and the rest of the crew surrounded him, their faces creased with concern and confusion, their voices mixing together in a babble of worried questions. "Jesus, Elias, you've been unconscious for hours," Sarah said, helping him sit up with gentle but firm hands. Her face was pale with worry, and he could see the relief flooding her features as he responded to her voice. "You just collapsed on deck while we were eating dinner. Found you lying right here, clutching that compass like your life depended on it. We were about to radio for a helicopter to take you to the mainland hospital." Elias looked down at his hands with growing wonder and confusion. The compass lay in his palm, cold and lifeless as any museum piece. Its brass was still green with age, its glass still spider-webbed with hairline cracks, but the dark stains that had seemed so alive, so hungry, had faded to the colour of rust. The needle hung motionless and dead, pointing nowhere, its supernatural purpose finally exhausted. "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears, rougher and older somehow, as if he'd been shouting orders across the din of battle. Just tired, really tired. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He was changed, marked by his journey through time in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He had witnessed the death of legend, had felt the weight of history in his hands, had seen the exact moment when one age ended and another began. The knowledge sat heavy in his chest, a burden he could never share because no one would believe him. That night, alone in his narrow bunk while the others slept and dreamed their mundane dreams, Elias held the compass up to the porthole's moonlight. The artifact was truly dead now, its cosmic purpose fulfilled. But for just a moment, so brief he might have imagined it, he saw a reflection in its cracked glass that wasn't his own. Wild eyes beneath a darker brow, a beard woven with smoke and legend, and a smile that held all the secrets of the deep and all the freedom that came with refusing to bow to any earthly authority. Then it was gone, leaving only the gentle rocking of the boat and the eternal whisper of the sea. But Elias knew that somewhere, in the space between seconds and the gap between worlds, a pirate's spirit sailed on, carrying with it the memory of their strange meeting and the weight of destiny fulfilled. The compass would never spin again. Its hunger was satisfied, its ancient debt paid in full. But the story it had preserved, the moment it had protected, would live on in the one person who had witnessed it firsthand. In the morning, when the sun painted the water gold and the world seemed clean and new again, he would return to his work, diving down to touch the bones of the past with reverent hands. But he would never again mistake those artifacts for mere objects, never again think of history as something safely distant and academic. Each piece carried with it the echo of a human heart, and some hearts, he now knew, beat strong enough to reach across centuries and call the future home. The compass had taught him that the past was never truly dead, that it lived on in the stories we told and the artifacts we preserved, waiting patiently for the right moment to remind us who we were and where we had come from. And somewhere in the depths of his transformed soul, Elias carried with him the dying words of a legend. Tell them we were here. Tell them we lived free. It was a charge he would honour for the rest of his life, a sacred trust between the present and the past, sealed in blood and bound by the mysterious forces that govern the tides of time itself.